Echoes of Blackwood Manor. Blackwood Manor. The name itself tastes like ash on the tongue. A skeletal silhouette clawing at the bruised twilight sky. It stands defiant against the gentle rolling hills surrounding it. A place where secrets festered like slow-growing mold, and tragedy bloomed in poisonous hues. Locals whisper of its dark history, tales passed down through generations, cautionary whispers that paint it as a place best left forgotten. They call it cursed, tainted, a magnet for misfortune. They say the land itself rejects its presence, refusing to yield life within its shadowed perimeter. For Sarah, a young woman barely scraping by in the city's gray underbelly, Blackwood Manor is more than just a decaying monument to a bygone era. It's a painful, unwanted inheritance. It's a puzzle box thrown into her lap following the sudden, inexplicable death of her estranged Aunt Eleanor. Estranged is perhaps too gentle a word. Sarah hadn't spoken to Eleanor in 15 years, not since a chilling incident during a childhood summer visit that left her with nightmares and a deep-seated aversion to the manor. Eleanor's will is no ordinary document. It's a labyrinth of cryptic phrases, unsettling instructions veiled in unsettling poetry, and a condition that sends a shiver crawling down Sarah's spine. She must return to Blackwood Manor, a place she swore she'd never set foot in again. The will dangles a tempting carrot, enough money to finally escape her dead-end job and build a life free from the gnawing anxiety that plagues her days. But the price might be her sanity, perhaps even her life. The initial unease begins with the house itself. The moment Sarah steps across the threshold, a palpable sense of wrongness settles over her. The air is thick, heavy with a cloying floral scent that seems to shift and change with the unseen drafts. Sometimes sickly sweet like decaying lilies, sometimes acrid like burnt rosemary, and something metallic. Shadows dance in the periphery of her vision, playing tricks on her eyes. Grotesque shapes seem to form and dissolve in the dim light, the familiar shapes playing tricks on her mind, making her question her sanity. The old floorboards groan underfoot, not just with age, but with a disturbing mimicry of whispers, sometimes seeming to echo her name, a breathy Sarah, that raises the hairs on the back of her neck. Sarah discovers Eleanor's journal tucked away in a dusty attic trunk. Its pages are filled with frantic, disjointed entries, chronicling her descent into paranoia and fear. Eleanor writes of strange occurrences, shadowy figures glimpsed in mirrors, and a growing sense of dread that suffocates her waking hours. She mentions the visitor, a figure that appears in the periphery of her vision, a fleeting impression of a woman with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. The visitor leaves behind a trail of cold spots, a bone-chilling drop in temperature that clings to the air, and the lingering scent of burnt rosemary. Eleanor's handwriting deteriorates as the entries progress, becoming erratic and nearly illegible, filled with desperate pleas for help and frantic denials. As Sarah delves deeper into Eleanor's past and the manor's secrets, the line between reality and hallucination begins to blur. She hears scratching sounds behind the walls, a rhythmic scritch-scratch-scritch that grows louder and more insistent with each passing night. It sounds like claws dragging across wood, a sound that burrows into her mind and refuses to let go. She finds strange symbols etched into the floorboards beneath loose rugs, symbols that seem to writhe and shift in the dim candlelight, resembling twisted vines and grotesque sigils. The old grandfather clock in the hall, a hulking presence shrouded in shadows, chimes at odd hours, its deep bong resonating through the house. Each toll a chilling reminder of the passage of time, or something else entirely. Sometimes the chimes seem to come from a different location, closer, almost inside her head. Sarah starts to experience vivid nightmares, visions of Eleanor trapped in a dark, suffocating space, her eyes wide with terror, pleading for release. She discovers that Eleanor had been dabbling in the occult, desperately attempting to contact a spirit she believed was haunting the manor, a spirit she hoped to appease, to banish, to understand. The journal reveals a series of rituals, incantations, and warnings about the dangers of invoking entities from beyond, foolishly thinking of herself as a white magic practitioner against the powerful dark force growing and lurking within. Then comes the shocking twist. The revelation that shatters Sarah's perception of her family and Blackwood Manor's history. Eleanor had a twin sister, a woman named Agnes, who is believed to have died in a fire years ago, a tragic accident that cast a long shadow over the family. However, the journal hints that Agnes might still be alive or something resembling her. The visitor from Eleanor's entries is revealed to be Agnes, or some dark entity that has taken her form, warped her essence into something malevolent and twisted. Agnes was a powerful practitioner of black magic, driven by a thirst for power and a deep-seated hatred for Eleanor. Her intent was never pure, her actions fueled by a desire to control the very forces she sought to manipulate. The manor's history reveals a dark secret, a horrifying tapestry woven with threads of sacrifices, dark rituals, and a pact made with a malevolent entity, a creature of pure darkness drawn to the manor by Agnes's vile magic. Now, the entity seeks to claim Sarah as its own, to complete the ritual Agnes started years ago. The house itself becomes a character, its rooms shifting and changing, corridors twisting and turning, trapping Sarah in a nightmarish labyrinth of her own fears. The very architecture seems to conspire against her, the walls closing in, the doors vanishing, the windows reflecting back her own terrified face. The inheritance. The envelope arrived on the Tuesday, stark white against the pile of junk mail and bills. Sarah almost tossed it, but the return address, embossed in faded silver, caught her eye. Blackwood Manor. A shiver traced its way down her spine, a primal reaction she hadn't felt since childhood nightmare. She hadn't thought about Blackwood Manor or her Aunt Eleanor in years. Estranged didn't begin to describe their relationship. Icebergs had more warmth. Eleanor had been different. A recluse. A collector of oddities. And, according to the whispers of Sarah's mother, a little bit crazy. Sarah had only visited Blackwood Manor once, a long and uncomfortable summer when she was 10. She remembered the oppressive silence, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Now, here it was again, clawing its way back into her life. With trembling fingers, Sarah tore open the envelope. Inside, nestled on a bed of brittle parchment, was a single sheet of paper. The will. Eleanor's will. The language was florid, almost archaic. Instead of simple clauses, there were riddles and warnings couched in metaphors that made Sarah's head spin. To my dearest niece, Sarah, I bequeath Blackwood Manor. May you find within its walls the truth that I so desperately sought, and may that truth not consume you. Beware of the shadows that dance in the corners, for they hunger for more than just darkness. The clock strikes 13 when the visitor arrives. Sarah felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This wasn't a simple inheritance. It was a trap. Eleanor had always had a flair for the drama, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. The rest of the will continued in the same vein, a labyrinth of cryptic phrases and unsettling instructions. The one constant was the insistence that Sarah return to the manor. "To claim your inheritance," they will read, "you must reside in Blackwood Manor for 30 days, beginning on the next new moon." Sarah laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. 30 days? In that crumbling mausoleum? No way. She tossed the will onto the coffee table, intending to call a lawyer and wash her hands of the whole mess. But as she turned away, she noticed something else in the envelope, a small, tarnished key. It was intricately carved, with a blackwood tree etched into its head. The key, she knew, was for the manor's front door. A wave of curiosity, a dangerous and irresistible force washed over her. What secrets did Blackwood Manor hold? What was Eleanor so desperate to warn her about? And who, or what, was this visitor? Against her better judgment, she Googled Blackwood Manor. The results were unsettling. Local urban legends painted the manor as a cursed place, haunted by tragedy and dark secrets. There were stories of unexplained deaths, strange rituals, and a family history steeped in madness. One article even mentioned Eleanor's eccentric research into the occult. Sarah knew she should stay away. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But the thought of leaving those secrets buried, of not knowing the truth about her family and the manor, was even worse. The need to understand outweighed the fear, and it was accompanied by her mind playing tricks on her, making her feel like she was being watched. The next new moon was in 2 weeks. With a sigh of resignation, Sarah began to pack. Blackwood Manor awaited, and something deep inside her whispered that she was walking into a nightmare. The journal secrets. The next day, Sarah found herself in the dusty library of Blackwood Manor, her fingers brushing against the spines of old leather-bound books. The room smelled of mildew and age, an overwhelming scent that made her nose wrinkle. She stumbled upon a worn red journal hidden behind a large, dusty book about ancient rituals and incantations. Eleanor's name was written in faded ink on the cover. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure if she wanted to delve deeper into her aunt's secrets. But her curiosity got better of her, and she opened the journal. The pages were filled with frantic entries about strange occurrences, shadowy figures, and a growing sense of dread. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she read about the visitor, a figure that appeared in Eleanor's peripheral vision, leaving behind a trail of cold spots and the lingering scent of burnt rosemary. As she continued to read, the journal revealed Eleanor's descent into madness and her obsession with the occult. She had dabbled in both white and black magic, attempting to contact a spirit she believed was haunting the manor. Sarah's heart raced as she read the entries about the rituals, incantations, and warnings about the dangers of invoking entities from beyond. The words seemed to leap off the page, and the room felt smaller, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. The journal revealed that Eleanor had a twin sister, a woman named Agnes, who was believed to have died in a fire years ago. However, the journal hinted that Agnes might still be alive, or something resembling her. The visitor from Eleanor's entries was revealed to be Agnes, or some dark entity that had taken her form. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the information. She had never known about Agnes, and the thought of a dark entity haunting the manor was terrifying. The journal mentioned strange occurrences, like the scratching sounds behind the walls, the rhythmic scritch, scratch, scritch that grew louder with each passing night. Sarah recalled the strange symbols etched into the floorboards, symbols that seemed to ride and shift in the dim candlelight. She remembered the old grandfather clock in the hall, its deep bong resonating through the house. Each told a chilling reminder of the passage of time, or something else. The journal entries became more frantic as Eleanor's encounters with Agnes grew more frequent. Sarah could almost hear her aunt's voice, trembling with fear as she wrote about the visitor's cold touch and the feeling of being watched. The journal ended abruptly, with Eleanor's last entry hinting at a final confrontation with Agnes and the entity. Sarah closed the journal, her hands shaking. The manor's history revealed a dark secret, a history of sacrifices, dark rituals, and a pact made with a malevolent entity. The entity drawn to the manor by Agnes's dark magic now sought to claim Sarah as its own. The house itself became a character, its rooms shifting and changing, trapping Sarah in a nightmarish labyrinth. The air was thick with a cloying floral scent that seemed to shift and change, sometimes sweet, sometimes acrid. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, and the old floorboards groaned underfoot, mimicking whispers that seemed to echo her name. Sarah's sleep was plagued by vivid nightmares, visions of Eleanor trapped in a dark, suffocating space, her eyes wide with terror. She could almost hear her aunt's screams, echoing through the manor's labyrinthine halls. The line between reality and hallucination blurred as Sarah delved deeper into the manor's dark secrets. The visitor seemed to be always present, its cold touch lingering on her skin, its whispers echoing in her mind. The final confrontation was inevitable, a battle between light and darkness. Sarah knew she had to face Agnes and the entity, to break the curse and free herself from the manor's malevolent grasp. As she prepared for the final confrontation, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm. She knew what she had to do, and she was ready to face her fears. The echoes remained. The final confrontation was a blur of shadows and energy, a battle between light and darkness. Sarah emerged victorious, but the manor was never the same. The air was still thick with a cloying floral scent, but the shadows no longer danced in the corners of her vision. The old floorboards no longer groaned underfoot, and the scratching sounds behind the walls had ceased. But Sarah could still feel the manor's influence, a lingering darkness that reminded her of the horrors she had faced. She knew the echoes of Blackwood Manor would remain with her, haunting her dreams and coloring her memories. As she packed her bags, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. She had grown to love the manor, despite its dark secrets and malevolent nature. But she knew it was time to leave, to start anew and leave the echoes of Blackwood Manor behind. As she stepped outside, the sun cast a warm glow over the manor, its skeletal silhouette standing tall against the twilight sky. Sarah took one last look at Blackwood Manor, the place where she had faced her fears and uncovered her family's dark secrets. And as she drove away, she knew the echoes of Blackwood Manor would remain, a haunting reminder of the horrors she had faced and the strength she had found within herself. Whispers in the walls. Sleep evaded Sarah. The heavy drapes in her inherited bedroom seemed to amplify the darkness, turning the familiar shadows into menacing shapes. She tossed and turned, the stiff linen sheet scratching against her skin, a constant low-level irritant mirroring the unease that had settled deep in her gut. It had started subtly, a creak in the hallway that could be settling the house, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, easily dismissed as tiredness. But now, after poring over Eleanor's increasingly frantic journal entries, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was actively toying with her. That night, it began again, a soft thump from somewhere above. Sarah held her breath, hard hammering against her ribs. Thump, 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 thump. It was rhythmic, unsettlingly so, like someone or something pacing in the attic. She told herself it was just her imagination, supercharged by the disturbing words she'd been reading. But the rationalizations felt thin, flimsy against the growing dread. Suddenly, a new sound joined the chorus of Blackwood Manor's nocturnal symphony. Scritch-scratch, scritch-scratch, scritch-scratch. It was coming from the wall beside her bed. A deliberate, insistent scratching, like claws dragging across old wood. Sarah bolted upright, pulling the covers tight around her. Her breath hitched in her throat. This wasn't settling. This wasn't imagination. This was something else. She reached for the lamp on the nightstand, her hand trembling. Click. Dot. The small lamp cast a weak circle of light, doing little to dispel the oppressive darkness. The scratching continued unabated. Scritch-scratch, scritch-scratch. It seemed to be getting closer, as if whatever was making the sound was burrowing its way through the wall. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. She knew, logically, that it was just a house. Old houses made noises. But her mind conjured images from Eleanor's journal, shadowy figures, cold spots, the lingering scent of burnt rosemary. She pressed her ear against the wall, trying to pinpoint the source of the scratching. It seemed to be emanating from directly behind the headboard, a place she couldn't see without moving the heavy antique bed. A wave of icy air washed over her, raising goosebumps on her arms. The temperature in the room had plummeted. Elevator effect is what Eleanor had written about it. Sarah could almost smell the sharp tang of burnt rosemary, even though she hadn't lit any. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. The sound was louder now, more frantic. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it all out. "It's just the house," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "It's just an old house." When she opened her eyes, she saw it. Just a flicker at first, a fleeting shadow in the corner of the room. But it was there. A dark, indistinct shape that seemed to writhe and shift in the periphery of her vision. The air grew heavy, thick with a cloying, floral scent that made her stomach churn. She blinked, and it was gone. But the scratching remained. Sarah knew she couldn't stay in the room. She had to find out what was behind the wall. With a surge of adrenaline, she threw back the covers and scrambled out of bed. The floorboards groaned under her weight, each creak echoing through the silent house like a warning. She wrestled with the heavy bed frame, pushing it away from the wall inch by inch. The scratching intensified, growing more insistent with each movement. As the bed finally cleared the wall, Sarah gasped. Etched into the aged wood paneling were symbols. Strange, unsettling symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim lamplight. They were unlike anything she'd ever seen before, yet they stirred something deep within her, a primal fear she couldn't explain. As she stared at the symbols, a low hum filled the room. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime, even though it was hours before its usual cycle. Bong, bong, bong. Each toll resonated through the house, each one a chilling reminder of the passage of time or something else, something she can't take her mind off of. The symbols on the wall seemed to glow faintly, and the scratching grew louder still. Sarah felt a presence behind her, cold and malevolent. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was empty, but she knew she wasn't alone. Blackwood Manor was awake, and whatever haunted its walls was now fully aware of her presence. The twins' shadow, the scritch-scratch-scritch, had become a constant companion. It pulsed through the walls, a relentless rhythm that burrowed into Sarah's skull. Sleep was a luxury, a distant memory replaced by fitful dozens punctuated by chilling nightmares. Eleanor, trapped in suffocating darkness, her eyes wide with silent terror, was a recurring theme. One morning, fueled by stale coffee and a growing sense of desperation, Sarah returned to the library. The floral scent that had been cloying was now overwhelmingly acrid, like burnt sugar and decaying lilies. She ran her fingers along the spines of ancient tome, each a potential key to unlocking the manor's grim secrets. It was then she noticed a loose floorboard beneath a Persian rug, its colors faded and muted by time. Lifting the board, she found a small, tarnished silver box. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a photograph. It depicted two women, identical in every way, their arms linked, smiling brightly. The resemblance to Eleanor was uncanny, but this was Eleanor X2. Twin sisters, identical. But Sarah only knew of one aunt. A chill snaked down her spine. Eleanor had a twin, Agnes. The name echoed in her mind, a phantom word from a forgotten language. The journal, lying open on the desk, seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. She flipped through the pages, her heart hammering against her ribs. There it was, tucked between frantic entries about the visitor. A single, chilling sentence. Agnes is not dead. She is something else. The journal detailed a fire decades ago that had supposedly claimed Agnes's life. A terrible accident, a tragic loss. But Eleanor's handwriting became progressively more frantic, more desperate. She wrote of Agnes's fascination with the occult, her dabblings in black magic. Eleanor had always dismissed it as eccentric until the shadows began to lengthen, and the cold spots appeared and the scent of burnt rosemary filled the air. Agnes, it turned out, wasn't just interested in tarot cards and seances. She delved into the forbidden arts, curses etched in blood, rituals performed under the pale moonlight, the invocation of entities. Eleanor feared that her sister had crossed the line, opened a door that should have remained sealed. The visitor wasn't a ghost, but something far more malignant. Eleanor believed Agnes, in her hunger for power, had made a pact with a malevolent entity. She'd used the manor itself as a conduit, its old stones soaked in generations of fear and sorrow. The entity was drawn to the darkness, to the potential for chaos and pain, and Agnes was its willing vessel. Sarah's breath hitched. She remembered the fleeting glimpses she'd caught, the shadowy figure in the periphery, the unsettling coldness that lingered. Could she have seen Agnes, or rather, what Agnes had become? The journal revealed that Eleanor, horrified by her sister's descent, had attempted to counteract the evil. She'd studied white magic, desperately trying to find a way to seal away Agnes and the entity she'd unleashed. She'd performed counter-rituals in the cellar using rosemary, hence the scent, and ancient incantations of protection. But it was a losing battle. Agnes was too strong, too deeply entwined with the darkness. A blood-curdling scream tore through the silence, shattering the relative peace of the library. It was coming from the kitchen, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Sarah lurched to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. Had it been her scream? No, it sounded like Mrs. Gable, the kind, elderly housekeeper who had welcomed her with such warmth. Sarah cautiously made her way toward the kitchen, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron poker beside the fireplace. The scritch, scratch, scritch intensified, growing louder, almost deafening. As she pushed open the kitchen door, she was met with a scene that would forever be etched into her memory. Mrs. Gable was pressed against the far wall, her eyes wide with horror, her body trembling uncontrollably. Standing before her, bathed in the flickering light of the gas lamps, was a figure that resembled Eleanor, but with a cruel, twisted smile and eyes that burned with an unholy light. "Agnes," Sarah whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. The labyrinth of shadows. The air in Blackwood Manor had grown thick, not just with the cloying floral scent, but with a palpable sense of wrongness. It pressed against Sarah, a suffocating blanket woven from fear and the echoes of Eleanor's madness. The shadows, once mere tricks of the candlelight, now possessed a disturbing sentience, stretching and contorting like grasping claws. It started subtly. The door she swore she'd left open was now firmly shut. A hallway that led to the library now twisted improbably towards the grand ballroom. The floorboards, always creaky, now groaned in a discordant symphony, each step seeming to taunt her. At first, Sarah attributed it to exhaustion, to the crumbling infrastructure of the ancient house. But the growing unease within her gut told a different story. She was lost. Not in the simple sense of geographical disorientation, but lost in the house itself. Blackwood Manor was no longer just a building. It was a prison, its architecture bending to some unseen malevolent will. Panic began to gnaw at the edges of her sanity. The scritch, scratch, scritch behind the walls had intensified, a frantic, maddening rhythm that sounded like fingernails scraping against bone. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed incessantly, not on the hour, but at random intervals, 3 bongs, then silence, then 5, each chime resonating deep within her chest, amplifying her fear. Bong, bong, bong. A chill deeper than any draft settled over her, the lingering scent of burnt rosemary, a constant, nauseating presence. She tried to retrace her steps, to follow the familiar path back to the relative safety of the main foyer, but the house seemed to actively resist her. A portrait of a stern-faced man whom she assumed was a Blackwood ancestor seemed to sneer as she passed. His eyes, previously lifeless, now followed her with unsettling intensity. Suddenly, the flickering candlelight cast long, grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. One of the shadows detached itself, solidifying into a vaguely human form, a flickering silhouette that mimicked her movements. Sarah gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was it Agnes, or some other entity, drawn from the darkness by the manor's twisted history? Desperate, she slammed open a nearby door, hoping to find refuge in one of the bedrooms. Instead, she found herself in a room she didn't recognize, a circular chamber with no windows, the walls lined with shelves containing strange, unlabeled jars filled with viscous, unidentifiable substances. The cloying floral scent was overpowering here, laced with a metallic tang that made her stomach churn. In the center of the room, a single flickering candle illuminated a small wooden table. On the table sat a tarnished silver locket, identical to one Eleanor used to wear. As Sarah reached out to touch it, a voice, raspy and cold, echoed through the room. "Looking for something, dear Sarah." She whirled around, but the room was empty. The voice seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a disembodied presence that revealed in her terror. "This house knows you, Sarah. It feels your fear. It feeds on it." The floor beneath her feet began to tremble. The walls seemed to close in, the shelves of jars rattling ominously. Sarah felt a surge of primal fear, the instinct to flee overriding all reason. She stumbled backward, slamming against one of the shelves. A jar fell, shattering on the floor, releasing a pungent, acrid odor that stung her eyes and burned her throat. The shadow form reappeared, closer now, its features coalescing into a grotesque parody of Agnes's face, twisted by hatred and madness. A low, guttural growl emanated from its form. "You cannot escape, Sarah. This house is mine." And soon you will be too. Sarah, trapped in the heart of Blackwood Manor's labyrinth, realized with chilling certainty that she was no longer just fighting a ghost, or even a malevolent entity. She was fighting the house itself. The walls, the shadows, the very air she breathed, all were weapons in its arsenal designed to break her, to consume her, to add her to the endless chorus of tormented souls trapped within its decaying walls. The fear was no longer a feeling. It was physical weight, crushing her, suffocating her, promising a slow, agonizing descent into madness. The ritual's edge. The cellar air hung thick and suffocating, heavy with the scent of damp earth, mildew, and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like old blood. The single flickering candle on a crude stone altar cast dancing shadows that stretched and writhed, turning familiar shapes into grotesque parodies. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence that had fallen, a silence far more terrifying than the scratching or the whispers. Agnes, or what was left of her, stood before the altar. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her bones, and her eyes burned with an unholy light. The floral scent that permeated the manor was overpowering here, acrid and cloying, making Sarah's stomach churn. Agnes chanted in a low, guttural tongue, a language that scraped against the inside of Sarah's skull, vibrating with a primal, sickening power. The symbols etched into the cellar floor seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with the rhythm of the incantation. Sarah's vision swam. She could feel the air tingling, a strange energy building, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She tried to move, to scream, but her limbs felt leaden, unresponsive. Paralyzed by fear, she could only watch as Agnes raised a rusty, ornate dagger above her head. "Eleanor tried to stop me," Agnes' voice rasped, a broken echo of the woman she once was. She thought her pathetic white magic could hold back the inevitable, but the pact is made. The bargain is struck, and you, Sarah, are the key. Sarah finally managed a choked gasp. What pact? Agnes' eyes gleamed with manic glee. A pact for power, for knowledge, for immortality. All it required was sacrifice. Generations of Blackwood women have served, preparing the way. And now, you will complete. Suddenly, the scratching, scritch, scratch, scritch, intensified, echoing from behind the damp stone walls. It was joined by a chorus of whispers, sibilant and urgent, swirling around Sarah like a vortex. The shadows danced faster, longer, solidifying into monstrous shapes in the periphery of her vision. She could feel something reaching for her, a cold, invisible presence that brushed against her skin, raising goose flesh and stealing her breath. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. A figure, tall and gaunt, shrouded in darkness, its features indistinct yet undeniably malevolent. The visitor, the entity. It oozed power, a palpable darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. Terror lent Sarah a sliver of strength. She remembered Eleanor's journal, the frantic scribblings about warding circles and protective symbols. Desperation clawed at her. She stumbled backward, her hand brushing against something cold and smooth on the damp stone floor. A shard of pottery. A piece of a broken plate. Taking a deep breath, ignoring the bile rising in her throat, Sarah forced herself to focus. She remembered seeing the symbol from the journal, a simple geometric design intended to repel evil, or so she hoped, etched into one of her aunt's trinkets. With shaking hands, she began to scratch the crude symbol into the dirt floor, using the pottery shard as a makeshift tool. As she finished the last line, a faint hum filled the cellar. The candle flame flickered violently, then steadied. The symbols on the floor glowed brighter. The scratching subsided. The whispers diminished. Agnes shrieked, the sound shattering the silence. "No! You can't stop it. The ritual is almost complete." The entity recoiled, hissing like a cornered animal. The air crackled with energy as the two forces, the crude symbol and the ancient evil, clashed. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate hope flickering in her chest. Agnes lunged, the rusty dagger raised high. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing for the blow. Then a deafening crack ripped through the air. The cellar floor trembled. Sarah screamed, shielding her face. When she dared to open her eyes, the candle had become extinguished. The symbols on the floor were dark. The air was still. Agnes was gone. The entity was gone. Only the suffocating silence remained. The heavy wooden door at the top of the cellar stairs creaked open, revealing only darkness beyond. Was it safe? Had she truly stopped the ritual? Or was this just a temporary reprieve, a lull before the storm? Sarah stumbled towards the stairs, each step agonizingly slow. The echoes of Blackwood Manor, the whispers, the scratching, the suffocating floral scent clung to her like a shroud. She didn't know what awaited her upstairs. She only knew that she had to escape. The echoes of the ritual, the pact, and the entity would forever linger in her mind, a chilling reminder of the horror she had narrowly survived. The echoes remained. The cellar air, thick with the stench of mildew and something older, something akin to dried blood, clung to Sarah's lungs. Agnes' cackling echoed in her ears, a sound that felt less human and more like the grating of stone on stone. The entity, a swirling vortex of shadow barely contained within Agnes' form, pulsed with malevolent energy. The ritual, it was close. Too close. Adrenaline, raw and biting, surged through Sarah. She scrambled back, tripping over a scattering of bones, animal bones she prayed, and slammed against the cold, damp stone wall. The etched symbols on the wall seemed to writhe, mocking her. They were a visual representation of chaos ripping through her mind. Scritch, scratch, scritch. Sas. The sound, fainter now, seemed to be receding, pulling away as the entity's power intensified. The scratching, she realized with growing horror, was the sound of it leaving Blackwood Manor, retreating to whatever dark dimension it had crawled from. But it wasn't leaving empty-handed. It was dragging a piece of her soul with it. Using the chaos as a cover, Sarah lunged for the rusted iron door leading out of the cellar. It was swollen and jammed, resisting her desperate tugs. She could feel Agnes's presence closing in, a wave of frigid air that prickled her skin. "You can't escape, niece," Agnes rasped. Her voice a distorted echo of the woman Eleanor once knew. "The ritual is almost complete. Your blood will bind us to this land, forever." Desperation fueled Sarah's efforts. She kicked at the door with all her strength, the metal groaning in protest. Finally, with a screech that tore through the oppressive silence, the door swung inward. She stumbled out, gasping for clean air, and didn't look back. She ran. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs screamed in protest. She ran until the skeletal silhouette of Blackwood Manor shrunk behind her, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. She didn't stop running until she reached the town's solitary motel, its neon sign flickering weakly against the bruised twilight sky. She booked a room, the clerk giving her a wide berth, sensing the aura of terror that clung to her like a shroud. My sleep didn't come easily. Every creak in the motel room, every shadow cast by the passing cars, sent her heart hammering against her ribs. She kept seeing Agnes's face, contorted in a rictus grin, her eyes burning with unnatural light. She kept hearing the scritch, scratch, scritch, a phantom sound that resonated deep within her bones. She escaped Blackwood Manor, yes. She survived the ritual, or at least she thought she did. But the manor's darkness had seeped into her, a subtle poison that tainted everything she touched. Weeks turned into months. Sarah tried to rebuild her life, returning to her old apartment, her old job. But the echoes of Blackwood Manor were always there, whispering in the corners of her mind. She found herself jumpy, paranoid, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her dreams were plagued by visions of the cellar, the symbols, the entity. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night, bathed in a cold sweat, convinced she could smell the acrid scent of burnt rosemary. One evening, while preparing dinner, Sarah noticed something odd. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from behind her kitchen wall. Scritch, scratch, scritch. She froze, her blood turning to ice. It couldn't be. Could it? Turning slowly, Sarah noticed a small, almost invisible symbol etched into the plaster of her wall. A symbol she knew all too well. The same symbol that had writhed in the cellar of Blackwood Manor. The entity hadn't been sealed away. It hadn't been retreated. It had simply followed her. Blackwood Manor might be in her past, but its darkness had a tendril in her present. And Sarah fears for the future. The future is bleak. She jumps at every shadow. It is slowly driving her to the brink of insanity. With who knows what is coming next. The scratching continued, growing louder, closer. Sarah backed away, her eyes wide with terror. The echoes of Blackwood Manor, they were just the beginning. They stay with her forever. The blood we inherit. The house stood like a skeletal sentinel at the edge of the woods, its tall spires reaching toward the moon as if to claw it from the sky. The once white paint had peeled away, revealing weathered wood that looked like the cracks on a parched ancient face. Daniel Graves stood in front of it, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. He hadn't set foot in this place since he was a child, and now at 22 he'd inherited it, along with the rest of his mother's estate, after her sudden death. "Does it look like Mom described it to you?" his younger sister Elena asked. She was 19, her voice trembling slightly as she hugged her arms to her chest. Her dark hair hung in a messy braid down her back, and her green eyes were wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. "She never described it," Daniel replied flatly. "She never talked about it at all." That was true. Their mother, Margaret, had always been tightly lipped about her past. She'd never spoken of her childhood or parents or why she'd left this house and this town behind. She'd built a new life for herself, for Daniel and Elena in the city. But now, she was gone, and here they were, stepping into a life she'd tried to leave behind. The locals had been quiet when they'd arrived in town. The real estate agent had handed over the keys with a nervous smile, avoiding their eyes. Even the grocery store clerk had seemed uneasy when they'd mentioned their last name. Graves. "This place feels wrong," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Like it's watching us." Daniel rolled his eye as though a part of him agreed. "It's an old house. It settles, that's all." But as they stepped inside, the heavy wooden door creaking shut behind them, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the scent of decay and something sharper, something metallic, like blood. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. That first night, Elena woke up screaming. She'd heard something in the walls, scraping, she said, like fingernails on wood. Daniel had tried to reassure her, but he'd heard it too. At first, he'd dismissed it as mice, but as the days went on, the sounds grew louder, more insistent. Footsteps in the attic, whispers in the dead of night, and shadows that moved when he wasn't looking. Then Daniel found the box. It was in the attic, hidden beneath a pile of yellowed linens and dusty trunk. The box itself was made of dark wood, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to twist and writhe in the dim light. A faint coppery smell clung to it, and what looked like dried blood sealed the lid. Daniel hesitated, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch it. Something about it felt alive. "Daniel." Elena's voice floated up from downstairs, soft and cautious. "What are you doing up there?" "Nothing," he called back, his voice firmer than he felt. "Just going through some stuff." He waited until he heard her retreat to her room before he returned his attention to the box. He knew he shouldn't open it. Something in his gut screamed at him to leave it alone, but a morbid curiosity drove him forward. He fetched a screwdriver from the kitchen and wedged it into the seam, prying the lid open with a horrible creak. Inside he found photographs, their edges curled and faded. They depicted people he didn't recognize, women in long dresses, men with stern expressions, and a little girl with hollow eyes. There were letters, too, tied with a frayed ribbon. They were addressed to someone named Abigail Graves, Daniel's great-grandmother. And at the bottom of the box lay a journal, its cover brittle and cracked with age. The journal's pages were filled with handwriting that slanted and looped in a way that made Daniel's head ache to read. But as he flipped through the pages, one phrase jumped out at him. The debt must be paid in blood. That night, Elena started sleepwalking. She'd wander into Daniel's room, her eyes glassy and unfocused, murmuring things that didn't make sense. One night, Daniel found her in the backyard digging at the earth with her bare hands. When he pulled her back to the house, her fingers were caked with dirt and her arms were covered in scratches she didn't remember getting. Their dog, Max, stopped eating. He'd sit by the door and whine, refusing to go near the attic. One morning, Daniel found him dead in the basement, his eyes gouged out. No blood, just empty sockets that stared up like twin voids. And then there were the blackouts. Daniel would wake up with no memory of how he'd gotten to where he was, his hands caked in dirt. Once, he found himself in the attic, the journal clutched in his hands. Another time he was in the woods, the moon hanging low in the sky. He didn't know what he'd done during those missing hours, but the fear that he might have hurt Elena kept him up at night. That was when Daniel realized the truth. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it had a purpose. The journal told the story of Abigail Graves, who'd made a deal with something ancient and malevolent, a spirit known only as the Pale Mother. The deal had been simple. In exchange for protection and prosperity, the Graves family would offer a sacrifice every few generations. One life given freely to keep the rest safe. Margaret had been the last one. She'd been born for this purpose, to be given to the Pale Mother. But she'd run, disappearing in the dead of night when she was just a teenager. And now, the debt had fallen to her children. Daniel tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was just an old story, but the signs were too clear. Elena began drawing strange symbols on the walls, her hand moving as if guided by something else. She'd speak in a voice that wasn't hers, low and guttural, and when Daniel looked in the mirror, he saw his own reflection smile back at him, even when he wasn't smiling. One night, they found a hidden passage behind the fireplace. It led to a chamber beneath the house, filled with bones. Daniel recognized some of them from the photographs he'd found in the box. These were his ancestors, the ones who'd been sacrificed to the Pale Mother. But Margaret had escaped, breaking the chain, and now the Pale Mother had come to collect what was owed. As the days passed, the house grew more restless. Doors slammed shut on their own, trapping Daniel in the hallway. The walls bled a slow black substance that dripped like tar. And the whispers, oh, the whispers, came from everywhere and nowhere. A constant, maddening hum in the background of their lives. Daniel tried to leave, to pack up the car and drive away, but the house wouldn't let him. Every time he reached the door, he'd feel a cold, unseen hand on his shoulder, pulling him back. The house had them now, and it wouldn't let them go. One night, the Pale Mother came. She was a towering figure, her form shifting and indistinct, like a shadow cast by nothing. Her face was a void, a hollow expanse where features should have been, and her presence filled the room with an unspeakable cold. Daniel tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Elena was gone, dragged down into the basement by shadowed hands he couldn't see. And then there was the ritual. The journal had described it in horrifying detail. One life given freely to satisfy the debt. Daniel could feel the Pale Mother's presence inside him, crawling through his veins like ice. He had a choice: sacrifice Elena and end the curse, or refuse and let the entity claim them both. In a desperate bid to stop it, Daniel turned to the journal. Buried in its pages was a reversal ritual, a way to trap the Pale Mother forever. But it required one final sacrifice, his own life. The house fought him every step of the way, the walls trembling with rage as he gathered the materials he needed. But in the end, it was just Daniel and the Pale Mother standing in the heart of the house as the foundations cracked and groaned around them. He lit the match, the flames licking at the old wood as the walls began to collapse. The last thing he heard was Elena screaming his name. Weeks later, the house was found abandoned, its walls covered in soot and ash. No bodies were ever recovered, but the locals knew better than to go inside. And when a new family moved in, drawn by the low price and the promise of a fresh start, their daughter found a wooden box in the attic. It was sealed with dried blood, an inscription in an old forgotten language. Inheritance comes with a price. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the crumbling house as Daniel and Elena stepped out of their car. The once white paint was now peeled and faded, revealing weathered wood beneath. The windows, like empty eyes, stared back at them, their glass shattered in places, leaving jagged teeth. The garden was a mess of overgrown weeds, and the heavy air felt thick with secrets. Inside, the house was musty, the air was thick with dust. Daniel coughed, running a hand over the cobweb-covered banister. Elena lingered by the door, her eyes wide with unease. "It's creepy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the creaking floorboards. Their mother, Margaret, had never spoken of this place, of her family or her past. Now she was gone, and they were here, inheriting a house that felt like a tomb. The next morning, Daniel drove into town for supplies. The village was small, with a single store and a post office. Inside, the store was dimly lit, shelves stocked with essentials. The clerk, an old man with sunken eyes, nodded curtly. "You're from the Graves place," he stated, his tone cold. Daniel nodded, but the man said no more, ringing up the groceries in silence. That night, darkness swallowed the house. Daniel and Elena huddled in the living room, the only light coming from a TV with a flickering picture. Max, their dog, lay by the door, his ears perked up, growling softly at nothing. Elena shivered, pulling a blanket tight. "I don't like it here," she said, her voice trembling. Daniel put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll make it home," he said, though his words felt hollow. As night deepened, the house creaked and groaned. Daniel tried to sleep, but the sounds were relentless. Creaks, whispers, and then, unmistakably, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, they echoed down the hall. Max barked, standing rigid, fur bristling. Elena appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "I heard something," she whispered, inside the walls. Her arms were crossed, and Daniel noticed faint scratches, red and raw .u. They lay awake, listening to the darkness. The house seemed to breathe, its walls exhaling sighs and whispers. In the attic, something shifted, a low scratch that sent chills down Daniel's spine. As the first light of dawn crept in, the noises faded. Exhausted, they drifted off, unaware of the shadows watching, waiting. The house had been empty, but now they were here, and the debt was coming due. In the morning, Daniel found an old photograph on the table, its edges curled. It showed a family he didn't recognize, their faces stern, standing in front of his house. On the back, a single word, "Mine." He felt a chill, the weight of the house pressing down. Whatever secrets it held, they were no longer buried. The pale mother was coming, and the Graves family's past was about to collide with their present. The box in the attic. The air was thick with the scent of decay as Daniel climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. Each step groaned beneath his feet, echoing through the empty house like a mournful sigh. The flashlight in his hand cast flickering shadows on the walls, making it seem as though the house itself was watching him. His younger sister, Elena, had been acting strange since they moved in, talking about whispers in the night and shadows that moved on their own. Daniel had dismissed it as anxiety, but now, as he pushed open the attic door, he felt a chill run down his spine. The attic was a labyrinth of old trunks, dusty boxes, and forgotten memories. Daniel's beam of light landed on an old locked wooden box in the corner. It was adorned with strange carvings, symbols he didn't recognize etched deeply into the wood. A faint reddish-brown stain sealed the lid, and Daniel's heart raced as he realized it might be dried blood. He hesitated, but his curiosity got better of him. He picked up the box, feeling its heavy, ominous weight in his hands. That night, as the house settled around them, Daniel lay awake, his mind racing. The creaks and groans of the old house sounded like footsteps, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He glanced at Elena, who was tossing restlessly in her bed. She was talking in her sleep, her voice barely audible, but the words sent a chill down his spine. Dig, find it, she muttered, her hands clawing at the air as if she were excavating something from the earth. In the morning, Daniel found Elena sitting at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she stared at the floor. Her nails were caked with dirt, and there were scratches on her arms. "Elena, what happened?" he asked, but she just shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't remember," she whispered. I don't remember anything. Their dog, Max, had been acting strangely too. He refused to go near the attic, and whenever Daniel tried to coax him upstairs, Max would growl low in his throat, his eyes fixed on something Daniel couldn't see. Now, as Daniel sat at the kitchen table, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. It was soft at first, like the sound of a mouse, but it grew louder, more insistent. He got up to investigate, but when he pressed his ear against the wall, the scratching stopped. That was when he decided to open the box. He found an old screwdriver in the garage and jammed it into the lock. The wood splintered as he pried it open, revealing a musty interior lined with black velvet. Inside, there were photographs, yellowed with age, and a brittle leather journal. The photographs depicted a family he didn't recognize standing in front of this very house. They were smiling, but their eyes seemed hollow, haunted. The journal was tied with a ribbon, and when Daniel untied it, the pages crackled with age. As he flipped through the journal, the words leapt off the page. It was written by his great-grandmother, Abigail Graves. The entry spoke of a deal made with something ancient and malevolent, a spirit known as the Pale Mother. Every few generations, one family member must be given as payment, or the entire family would suffer. Daniel's heart pounded as he read the words, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He tried to tell himself it was just an old superstition, but the weight of the box in his hands, the symbols carved into it, and the photographs of his ancestors all seemed to scream that this was real. And then, as he read the last entry, he heard a sound behind him. He turned, but there was no one there. The scratching in the walls had started again, louder now, more insistent. Daniel closed the journal, his hands shaking. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down he knew the truth. The house had been waiting for them, and now that they were here, the debt would have to be paid. As the darkness outside seemed to press in, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows in the room seemed to move of their own accord, twisting into forms that didn't belong to anything human. He tried to focus on the journal, but the words blurred on the page. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more frantic, and Daniel felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He knew then that the box was just the beginning, and the horror that had haunted his family for generations was far from over. A family's forgotten past. The attic was a place where time seemed to stand still, its air thick with dust and the scent of decay. Sunlight struggled through grimy windows, casting long shadows that danced like skeletal fingers on the walls. Daniel knelt before the old wooden box, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to riot in the dim light. A rusted lock held it sealed, with a stain that looked like dried blood marring the front. With a deep breath, Daniel picked up a screwdriver, its metal scraping against the lock with a chilling screech. The sound echoed through the silent attic like a scream. Finally, the lock gave way, and the box creaked open, releasing a musty smell into the air. Inside, Daniel found a brittle leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Alongside it were photographs, their edges curled and letters tied with a faded ribbon. The journal's first entry was dated 1923, the handwriting frantic and erratic, as if the writer had been in a hurry or distress. Abigail Graves wrote about a ritual, a sacrifice to keep their family safe from an ancient evil known as the Pale Mother. Daniel's eyes scanned the pages, disbelief etched on his face. This was just an old superstition, he told himself. But the words lingered, heavy with a foreboding that made the attic feel colder. As he read on, the air seemed to thicken, and the shadows deepened. The photographs depicted grave-looking people in old-fashioned clothing, their expressions somber. One showed a family gathered around a grave, their faces filled with a mix of sorrow and fear. Another was of a young girl, her eyes black as coal, staring into the camera with an unsettling intensity. The letters, when untied, revealed a disturbing correspondence. They spoke of debts owed in blood, of family members who had vanished, and of a presence that lingered in the house, waiting. Each letter ended with a plea to never return, to never uncover the past. Daniel dismissed it all as the ramblings of a madwoman, but the weight of the journal in his hands felt heavier now. He placed everything back in the box, his mind racing. The creaking of the attic floorboards under his feet echoed too loudly, making him jump. That night, The house seemed to hum with an eerie silence. Daniel and Elena had settled into their rooms, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. But as Daniel drifted to sleep, a faint whisper echoed through the hallway, a soft, raspy voice calling his name. He sat up with a start, heart pounding. The voice called again, this time clearer. Daniel. It was Elena. He threw on a shirt and hurried to her room, the floorboards groaning under his feet. Her door creaked as he pushed it open. Elena was sitting up in bed, her eyes open but unfocused. The room was cold, an unnatural chill that made Daniel's skin crawl. Max, their dog, was lying at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on something across the room, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Elena, what's wrong? Daniel asked, but she didn't respond. Instead, she spoke in a voice that was not her own, a low, gravelly voice that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. The debt is due, Daniel. It's time to pay. Daniel froze, his breath catching. The voice was ancient, filled with a malevolence that made the air feel heavier. Elena's eyes flickered, and for a moment they looked black, like the girl in the photograph. No, this isn't real, he muttered, but his voice trembled. The room seemed to darken, as if shadows themselves were closing in. Max's growl turned into a full-blown bark, but he retreated under the bed, whimpering. Elena's body jerked violently, her head snapping towards Daniel. Her eyes, now back to normal, focused on him, and she gasped. What happened? She asked, her voice her own again. Daniel backed away, his mind racing. You were talking in your sleep, he stammered, trying to hide the fear in his voice. Elena looked around the room, confusion etched on her face. I don't remember coming here. I was having the weirdest dream, she said, her voice small. Daniel forced a smile. It's just a dream. Let's go back to bed. But as he left her room, the weight of the journal's words pressed down on him. The Pale Mother. Rituals. Sacrifices. It couldn't be real, could it? He tried to convince himself it was just old stories, but the voice, the shadows, the cold, they lingered, refusing to be dismissed. Back in his room, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He lay awake, the darkness pressing in, until finally, exhaustion took over. But even in sleep, the shadows danced, whispering a single, chilling word. Soon. The debt in blood. Daniel sat cross-legged on the dusty attic floor, the brittle journal resting on his knees. The flickering flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls, making it seem as though the shadows themselves were listening. Each page he turned revealed a darker piece of his family's history, the words scribbled in a frenzy by his great-grandmother, Abigail Graves. As he read, the air grew thick with an unsettling chill. The journal spoke of a deal struck long ago, a desperate bargain with a being known only as the Pale Mother. She was an ancient spirit, faceless and void of mercy, who demanded a sacrifice every few generations in exchange for the family's prosperity. Each sacrifice was meant to appease her, to keep her darkness at bay. Daniel's breath hitched as he read about the ritual, the words leaping off the page with a malevolence that made his skin crawl. The Pale Mother's presence was described as a cold whisper, a shadow that clung to the edges of vision, always watching, always waiting. Margaret, their mother, was the chosen one, destined to be the last sacrifice. But she had run, escaping the fate that had haunted their family for generations. Now the debt had fallen to Daniel and Elena, and the Pale Mother would not rest until it was paid. As Daniel delved deeper, the attic seemed to close in around him. The creaks of the old house sounded like whispered threats, each groan a reminder of the weight of the curse. He could feel eyes upon him, the weight of unseen gazes pressing down, making it hard to breathe. A sudden chill ran down his spine as he heard a faint whisper, soft and raspy, speaking a name he couldn't discern. The flashlight flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the attic into darkness. "Elena!" he called out, his voice shaking slightly. There was no answer. He fumbled for the flashlight, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. When he turned it on again, the beam landed on a symbol etched into the wall, a twisted mark that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Downstairs, Elena was in the kitchen, staring at the wall with a blank expression. Her hand moved across the surface, leaving behind trails of something dark and wet. She didn't notice Daniel standing in the doorway, didn't flinch as he called her name. "Elena, what are you doing?" he asked, stepping closer. She turned, her eyes glassy, her voice not her own. "She's coming," she whispered, her tone low and unfamiliar. "She's already inside." Daniel's heart pounded as he grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Elena, snap out of it," he pleaded, fear rising in his chest. She blinked, confusion replacing the emptiness in her eyes. "Daniel, what happened?" But Daniel knew. The pale mother had made her first move, her presence seeping into their reality like a cold mist. He couldn't deny it any longer. The curse was real, and it was closing in. That night, the house came alive with sounds. Creaks and groans turned into knocks, each one louder, more insistent. Daniel and Elena huddled together, their breath short in panic. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, eager to get in. As they listened, the knocks formed a rhythm, a heartbeat that echoed through the house. It was then that Daniel realized the horrifying truth. The pale mother wasn't just a spirit. She was the house itself, alive and waiting. The first knock shattered a window, shards of glass scattering like icy rain. The siblings screamed, their voices drowned out by the escalating cacophony. The house was no longer just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, determined to claim what was owed. In the chaos, Daniel lost hold of Elena's hand. When he turned, she was gone, vanished into the darkness. His calls were met with silence, and the only sound was the relentless knocking, echoing through the house like a death knell. The debt was due, and the pale mother would not be denied. The signs of the curse had. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows of the house like a living thing, suffocating the siblings in its grip. It had been weeks since Daniel and Elena moved into their grandmother's house, and the strange occurrences had only grown more frequent and more disturbing. Elena's sleepwalking had become a nightly ritual, her small frame wandering the house under the cover of darkness. But tonight was different. Tonight she didn't just wander, she created. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the dim light of the porch. The creak of the old wooden floorboards upstairs broke the silence, and he tensed, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't the first time he'd heard the sound, but it never got any easier. He waited, his ears straining to pick up the next noise. It came, a low, guttural murmur that didn't sound like Elena at all. It sounded older, deeper, as if something else was using her voice. He pushed himself to his feet, the chair scraping against the floor with a sharp screech. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the stairs, the air thick with an almost palpable sense of dread. The creaking grew louder as he climbed, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the top, he froze. Elena was in the hallway, her back to him. Her arms moved in slow, jerky motions as if she were painting. But there was no brush in her hand, only her fingers smeared with something dark and wet. The walls were covered in symbols, intricate and twisted, drawn in a substance that glistened under the faint moonlight streaming through the window. Daniel's stomach turned as he realized what it was. Blood. But whose? "Elena?" he called out softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Instead, she kept moving, her body swaying as if to a rhythm only she could hear. Daniel approached her cautiously, his bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. As he got closer, he could see the symbols more clearly. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen before, twisted, angular shapes that seemed to shift and writhe on the wall like living things. He reached out to grab her arm, but before he could, she turned to face him. Her eyes were open, but they weren't hers. They were black, the irises swallowed by an inky darkness that seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. Daniel's blood ran cold as she spoke, her voice low and raspy, like the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. "Let me go," she hissed, her small body rigid and unyielding. Daniel's grip tightened on her arm as he tried to shake her awake, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she twisted out of his grasp and darted down the hall, disappearing into the darkness. "Elena," Daniel shouted, chasing after her. But she was gone. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of Max's frantic barking. The dog had been acting strangely since they moved in, refusing to go into certain rooms and growling at nothing. But this was different. This was a sound of pure terror. Daniel threw off the covers and ran downstairs, his heart racing. The barking stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. He found Max in the basement, his body lying still on the cold concrete floor. The dog's eyes were gone, 2 gaping holes where they should have been. A faint trail of blood led from the body to the far corner of the room, where the walls were smeared with the same dark symbols Elena had drawn the night before. Daniel's stomach churned as he backed away, his mind racing. What was happening to his sister? And what was happening to him? Over the next few days, Daniel began to experience blackouts. He would wake up in places he didn't remember going to, his hands covered in dirt and his clothes smelling of mold. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself it was just stress, but deep down he knew something was wrong. The house was changing them, twisting them into something they weren't. And then there was the passage. It started with a noise, a faint, scratching sound coming from the fireplace. At first, Daniel dismissed it as a mouse, but as the days went by, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. One night, after Elena had disappeared into her room, Daniel decided to investigate. He knelt in front of the fireplace, his fingers tracing the edges of the old stone. As he pressed on one of the stones, there was a loud click, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow passageway. Daniel hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. The air coming from the passage was cold and musty, filled with the scent of decay. But he had to know what was down there. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and stepped into the darkness, the wall creaking shut behind him. The passageway was narrow, the walls made of rough-hewn stone that seemed to press in on him from all sides. As he walked, the air grew colder, the smell of rot growing stronger. Finally, he reached a large underground chamber, the ceiling lost in darkness. The room was filled with bones, human bones, scattered across the floor like trash. In the center of the room, a large stone altar stood, its surface stained with blood. Daniel's breath came in short gasps as he realized what he was looking at. This was no ordinary grave. This was a place of sacrifice. And then he heard it, a low, whispery voice that seemed to come from all around him. It spoke in a language he didn't understand, but the words sent chills down his spine. Daniel turned to run, but the passageway was gone. The walls had shifted, trapping him. He was alone, surrounded by the remains of his own family. As he stood there, frozen in fear, the voice grew louder, the words becoming clearer. It was calling him, drawing him closer to the altar. Daniel's legs felt heavy, as if an unseen force was pulling him toward the bloody stone. And then, everything went black. When Daniel came to, he was lying on the floor of the chamber, his head pounding and his mouth dry. The room was silent now, the voice gone. But he knew what he had seen. The Graves family had been keeping a horrifying secret for generations, and now Daniel and Elena were the ones who had to pay the price. The house was never meant to be empty, and now that they were back, the debt had to be collected. As Daniel crawled back through the passage, his mind raced with thoughts of escape, of running as far away as possible. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. The curse had already taken root, and it wouldn't let them go without a fight. The house had them now, and it would do whatever it took to keep them, the ones who came before. The air in the basement was heavy, thick with the scent of decay and forgotten years. Dust motes hung lazily in the dim light, casting long shadows that seemed to riot on the walls. Daniel and Elena stood amidst the scattered bones, the silence between them oppressive. The walls were etched with symbols, old and faded, resembling something that might once have been blood. "This isn't just any grave," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the creaking of old wooden beams. These people were sacrificed. Elena's eyes were distant, her gaze drifting over the bones as if seeing something beyond them. "They were given," she murmured, her voice not her own. It was lower, raspier, sending a shiver down Daniel's spine. Suddenly, a faint rustling echoed through the room. Bones shifted, clicking softly against each other. Daniel froze, his heart pounding as the noise grew louder, the bones moving as if pushed by an invisible force. "Elena?" he ventured, but she didn't respond. She turned to him, her eyes black as coal. "She's coming!" she intoned, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. "She's already inside you." Daniel stumbled back, fear gripping his chest. The lights flickered, shadows dancing like dark specters. A cold spot formed around him, the air chilling rapidly. Upstairs, the mirror in the hallway caught his attention. His reflection stared back, but when he frowned, it smiled. He blinked, and for a moment, his reflection's eyes turned black. "Elena, I need to show you something," Daniel urged, pulling her towards the stairs. Her resistance was unnatural, as though something held her back. But she followed. Her movements were jerky and unnatural. In the hallway, the mirror hung ominously. Daniel's reflection smiled again, this time without him. Elena's voice, still not her own, whispered, "She's in you, Daniel." He spun around, but she was gone. The basement door slammed shut, trapping him. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing with a malevolent life. Daniel was alone, the weight of the house's history crushing him. The pale mother's presence loomed, a cold dread seeping into his bones. As he stood there, the darkness seemed to whisper his name, a slow, ominous chant. The house creaked and groaned, each sound a reminder of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. And in the mirror, his reflection smiled again. The return of the pale mother. The house had always felt alive, but tonight it was breathing. The walls creaked and groaned like an old man struggling to rise from a chair, each sound echoing through the empty halls. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the flickering light of a single candle casting long, ominous shadows on the walls. The air was thick and heavy, like a breath held too long. He had tried to leave earlier, run away from the house and everything it represented, but the doors wouldn't budge. The windows refused to open. It was as if the house had swallowed him whole. Elena was gone. She had been missing for hours, and Daniel had searched every room, every corner, but there was no sign of her. The only trace was the faint sound of her voice, whispering in the walls. He had tried to follow it, to listen closer, but it led him in circles. Now, he could feel the weight of the house's gaze on him, pressing down like a hand on his chest. And then the whispers started. At first they were soft, a distant murmur that could have been the wind outside. But they grew louder, clearer, until Daniel could make out the words. "Daniel, Daniel, come and see." The voice was low, raspy, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his shaking hands, but it was no use. The fear had taken hold, and he couldn't shake it. The candle on the table suddenly flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Daniel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel his breath hitching, catching in his throat like a fishhook. And then the lights came back on, except they weren't the warm golden glow of the candle. They were cold blue, and they pulsed with a life of their own. The walls began to bleed. At first it was just a trickle, a thin line of dark liquid seeping through the cracks in the paint. But it spread, pooling on the floor and dripping from the ceiling. The air filled with the metallic smell of blood, and Daniel's stomach twisted into knots. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the floor with a loud screech, and stood up. His legs trembled beneath him, but he forced himself to move. "Elena?" he called out, his voice shaking. "Elena, where are you?" There was no answer. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost a scream in his ears. "Daniel, Daniel, come and see, come and see." He didn't know where to go, but he knew he had to move. The house was pulling him, guiding him towards some unknown destination. He walked slowly, his feet heavy as if rooted to the floor. Every step echoed through the hall, and the bleeding wall seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. He could feel the house watching him, waiting for him to make a wrong move. And then he heard it, a faint cry, muffled and distant, but unmistakable. "Elena!" Daniel shouted, his voice breaking. He ran toward the sound, his feet pounding against the floor, but the house seemed to shift around him. Doors slammed shut in front of him, and new ones opened, leading him deeper into the labyrinth of rooms. The bleeding walls seemed to close in on him, the blood pooling at his feet and making every step slippery. Finally, he reached the basement door. It was slightly ajar, and the cry had come from below. Daniel hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The whispers had stopped, and the house was silent now, waiting. He pushed the door open and started down the stairs, his heart pounding in his ears. The air grew colder with each step, until he could see his breath in front of him. At the bottom of the stairs, he found Elena. She was standing in the center of the room, her back to him. Her shoulders were slumped, and her head was tilted to one side as if she were listening to something. Daniel called her name, but she didn't move. He took another step forward, and that was when he saw it. Her hands were covered in blood. "Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She turned then, her eyes black as coal, and Daniel froze. It wasn't Elena anymore. Whatever had taken her was ancient, evil, and it was staring back at him with eyes that had seen the end of the world. "Welcome home, Daniel," it said, Elena's voice twisting into something unrecognizable. "She's been waiting for you." And then the darkness closed in. The house came alive around him, the walls slamming shut, the floor shaking beneath his feet. Daniel tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The last thing he heard was Elena's voice screaming his name before the darkness swallowed him whole. The pale mother had returned, and she had come for her debt. The ritual must be completed. The air was thick and heavy, like a suffocating blanket of dread. Daniel's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he stood in the dimly lit basement, the walls lined with the bones of his own family. The ground beneath him seemed to hum with unnatural energy, as if the house itself were alive and watching him. His hands trembled as he held the journal, its pages yellowed and cracked, but the words within burned with a sinister clarity. The debt must be paid in blood, the journal had read. One must be given, or all be lost. Elena was gone. One moment she'd been beside him, her eyes wide with fear, but her voice was steady. The next, she'd vanished into the shadows, dragged away by unseen hands. Now the only sound was the faint whisper of her name, echoing through the cold, damp air. "Daniel, Daniel." But it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, distorted as if something else was speaking through her. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The basement stretched out before him, a labyrinth of darkness. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than the last, as if the house itself was amplifying his fear. He could feel eyes on him, cold, unblinking eyes, watching him from the darkness. His skin crawled with the sensation, and he spun around, but there was nothing there. Or so he told himself. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing around him. He could see his breath misting in front of him, and the faint scent of decay filled his nostrils. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the sound of running water, but it was distorted, almost rhythmic. It sent a chill down his spine. As he turned a corner, he saw her. Elena died. She was standing in the center of a circle drawn on the floor, its edges marked with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. Her eyes were black as coal, and her voice, when she spoke, was not her own. "Daniel," she said, her tone low and menacing. "She's been waiting." Behind her, the shadows seemed to coalesce into a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting and flowing like smoke. The pale mother. Her face was a blank, featureless expanse, but her presence was overwhelming. Daniel could feel her power coursing through the air, a sickening mixture of dread and fascination. He wanted to run, to scream, to hide, but his legs wouldn't move. His voice caught in his throat. The pale mother reached out a long, shadowy hand and placed it on Elena's shoulder. Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that stretched across her face like a crack in porcelain. "The debt must be paid," the pale mother hissed, her voice like a chorus of whispers. "Blood for blood, life for life." Daniel's mind raced. He thought of his mother, Margaret, and the secrets she'd kept. He thought of the generations before her, the sacrifices they'd made to keep their family safe. And he thought of Elena, his sister, his best friend, the only family he had left. "I won't let you take her," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "I won't let you hurt her." The pale mother's head tilted to one side, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "You have no choice," she whispered. "The curse is ancient. It cannot be broken, only paid." Daniel's fingers tightened around the journal. He read the words over and over until they were burned into his mind. One must be given, or all will be lost. He knew what he had to do, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not Eleanor. Not his sister. "Then take me," he said, his voice breaking. "If you need blood, take mine. Let her go." The pale mother laughed, a sound that was both deafening and barely audible, like a scream in his ear and a whisper in his mind. "You are not the one who owes the debt," she said. "Your sister is the chosen one. Her blood is pure. Her soul is strong. She will be the payment." Elena's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Daniel saw a glimmer of his sister in there. She mouthed a single word, "Run," but it was too late. The pale mother's grip tightened on Elena's shoulder, and she let out a scream that was both familiar and alien. Daniel lunged forward, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The walls closed in, the bones rattling ominously. The house itself was against him. He fell hard onto the cold floor. The wind knocked out of him. As he struggled to breathe, he heard the sound of Elena's voice, distorted and distant, calling out to him. "Daniel! Daniel! Help me!" He crawled to his feet, his heart pounding in his ears. The ritual was already beginning. The symbols on the floor glowed brighter, and the air seemed to vibrate with dark energy. Elena's body began to shake, her eyes rolling back in her head as the pale mother leaned closer, her mouth open in a silent scream. Daniel knew he had to act. He fumbled through the journal, his fingers trembling as he flipped to the last page. There in the corner was a single sentence. To break the curse, the blood of the sacrificer must be spilled by their own hand. He didn't have time to think. He grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor and pressed it to his wrist. The pain was sharp, immediate, and he gritted his teeth as blood began to flow. He splattered it onto the symbols, watching as they sizzled and died, the glow fading into darkness. The pale mother's scream filled the room, a deafening roar that shattered the walls and sent bones crashing to the floor. Daniel stumbled forward, grabbing Elena and pulling her into his arms. She was limp, unresponsive, but she was alive. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's over?" But as he looked up, he saw the pale mother's form begin to shift, to twist and contort until she was no longer a figure, but a shadow that began to spread, creeping across the walls, up the stairs, and into the heart of the house. "No," Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible. "It's not over. It's never over." And then everything went black. The final choice. The air was thick with dust and the stench of decay as Daniel crawled through the narrow, crumbling passage behind the fireplace. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. Cobwebs clung to his face, and the sound of scuttling creatures echoed through the tight space, making his skin crawl. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, as if it were alive and determined to keep him trapped. Daniel had spent hours searching the journal for any clue, any hope, after Elena had been dragged screaming into the basement. The words on the yellowed pages had blurred together, but one passage kept coming back to him. The debt cannot be undone, but it can be reversed. The pale mother must be bound, trapped in the vessel from which she came. He didn't know what the vessel was, but he had to try. The house seemed to shift around him as he moved, corridors stretching and shrinking in ways that defied logic. Every step he took felt like a betrayal, as though the house itself was conspiring against him. And yet he pressed on, driven by a desperation he couldn't ignore. Finally, he found it, a hidden chamber deep beneath the house, its walls lined with ancient symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat the wooden box he had found in the attic. It was open now, its lid hanging crookedly from hinges that looked like they had been forced. Inside there was nothing but a faint, pulsating glow. Daniel froze, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air in the room felt colder, heavier, and he could sense a presence around him, watching him. He didn't dare look behind him, didn't dare acknowledge the shadowy figure he knew was there. Instead, he focused on the box, his hands trembling as he reached for it. As soon as he touched it, the room erupted into chaos. The walls began to bleed, thick, black liquid oozing from the symbols and pooling on the floor. The sound was sickening, drip, 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 and it seemed to come from all directions. The air filled with whispers, a cacophony of voices that spoke in a language Daniel couldn't understand. The flashlight in his hand flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging him into dark. "Elena!" he called out, his voice shaking. There was no answer. The darkness seemed to press in around him, suffocating him. He could feel eyes on him, cold, unblinking eyes, and the weight of the pale mother's presence was crushing. He knew she was close, closer than ever before, and he also knew he was running out of time. Daniel fumbled in his pocket for the lighter he had found in the attic. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold it, but he managed to flick it on, the small flame casting a weak, golden light over the room. The blood on the wall seemed to writhe in the light, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. He opened the journal to the passage he had found earlier and began to read aloud, his voice trembling. The words were ancient, unfamiliar, but he spoke to them with desperation that made his voice ring out clearly in the small room. As he read, the glowing light from the box began to pulse faster, and the whispers grew to a deafening roar. The pale mother appeared in front of him, her towering form filling the room. Her hollow eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and her mouth, filled with rows of sharp, decayed teeth, opened in a scream that was both sound and silence. Daniel fell to his knees, the lighter slipping from his fingers and extinguishing the flame. The darkness was absolute, and the weight of her presence was unbearable. But he didn't stop reading. Even as the words blurred on the page, even as the fear threatened to consume him, he kept going. The ritual had to be completed. The pale mother's scream grew louder, more anguished, and the blood on the walls began to boil, hissing as it hit the floor. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The blood stopped flowing. The pale mother's scream was cut short, and she vanished as quickly as she had appeared. The room was silent, the only sound Daniel's ragged breathing. He didn't move, didn't dare to. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest for what felt like an eternity. And then slowly he got to his feet, the lighter trembling in his hand as he lit it again. The room was still, the symbols on the walls no longer glowing. The box on the pedestal was empty, and the blood had stopped flowing. But as he turned to leave, he heard a sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Daniel. It was Alana's voice. He turned, his heart leaping with hope, and called out again, "Elena, where are you?" There was no answer. Daniel took a step forward, his lighter casting long shadows on the walls. "Elena," he repeated, his voice louder, now more desperate. And then he heard it again, a faint whisper, soft and distant. "Daniel." This time, it didn't come from the passage. It came from the box. Daniel froze, his blood running cold. The box was empty, but the voice was coming from inside it, echoing off the wooden walls. He approached it slowly, his heart pounding, and peered inside. The box was empty, but the voice was closer now, more insistent. "Daniel," it whispered again, the sound echoing in his mind. "Help me." Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. The ritual had worked. The pale mother was trapped, bound in the box, but at a cost. The voice in the box wasn't Elena. It was him. Or at least, it was a part of him. The ritual had required a sacrifice, and Daniel had unknowingly given it. He could feel it now, a void inside him, a piece of his soul torn away and trapped in the box alongside the pale mother. He was free to leave the house, to walk away from the curse, but he would never be whole again. And as he stood there, the weight of what he had done settled over him. Daniel realized that the curse was far from over. The pale mother was trapped, but the house was still standing, waiting. And one day, someone else would come. Someone else would find the box, and the cycle would begin again. Daniel left the chamber, The box clutched tightly in his hand and made his way back through the winding passages to the main house. The walls seemed to watch him as he moved, the air growing colder with every step. He could feel the weight of the box in his hand and the presence of the pale mother trapped inside, and he knew that he would never be able to escape her completely. As he reached the front door, he heard a sound behind him. Light, faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Daniel turned, the lighter in his hand casting flickering shadows on the walls. And then he saw her, Elena, standing at the top of the stairs, her eyes black as coal, her skin pale and cold. She smiled a small twisted smile, and Daniel knew that she was gone. The pale mother had taken her, and there was nothing he could do to bring her back. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low, menacing. "Now you'll never leave." Daniel didn't have time to react. Elena descended the stairs in a blur of motion, her movements unnatural, inhuman. He tried to run, but the floor beneath him seemed to shift, to twist, and he fell hard, the lighter slipping from his hand. The darkness closed in around him, and he was alone. And then there was nothing. When the police found Daniel's car, it was parked outside the house, the engine still running, the headlights shining into the empty darkness. But Daniel was never found. The house stood silent, its doors hanging open, its windows like empty eyes staring into the night. And in the attic, the wooden box sat quietly waiting. The story of the Graves family became a legend, a cautionary tale told around campfires and in hushed whispers. But the truth was far more terrifying. The house was never meant to be empty, and now that the Graves family had returned, the debt had to be paid. And in the end, it was Daniel who paid it, his soul trapped alongside the pale mother in the wooden box, forever bound to the curse that had haunted his family for generations. The house remained standing, a monument to the horrors that had taken place within its walls. And the cycle continued, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble into its clutches. The old house stood silently, its towering spire piercing the sky like a skeletal finger. The garden, once manicured, now sprawled with overgrown bushes and vines that clawed at the walls. The windows, once bright, were now dull and covered in grime, reflecting the eerie silence within. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a car driving by. The house had been emptying for weeks, its grandeur overshadowed by an unsettling aura that deterred even the most curious onlookers. Rumors swirled in the small town, whispers of a cursed family in a house that devoured its inhabitants. But when the Smiths moved in, they dismissed the tales as mere folklore. The house was a steal, a sprawling mansion at a fraction of its worth, and they weren't about to let superstition stand in their way. The Smiths were a lively family, John the father, ever the skeptic, Mary the mother with a knack for decorating, and their daughter, Emily, a curious teenager with a penchant for mystery. Emily had always been drawn to the unknown, and the whispers about the house only piqued her interest. She roamed the empty halls, her footsteps echoing off the walls, as she imagined the lives of those who came before. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor, Emily ventured to the attic. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden floor creaked beneath her feet. She fumbled through old trunks and forgotten belongings until her fingers were brushed against something smooth, a wooden box, adorned with strange symbols and a rusty lock. It felt cold to the touch, and as she lifted it, a shiver ran down her spine. Curiosity overtook caution, and Emily picked the lock with a hairpin. The box creaked open, releasing a faint whisper like a sigh from another world. Inside, she found old photographs, a journal, and letters tied with a ribbon. As she flipped through the journal, the words spoke of a debt, of blood and sacrifice. The letters were from a girl named Elena, her voice trembling with fear as she wrote of an entity, the pale mother. Emily's heart raced, but she couldn't look away. The words were disturbing, yet she felt a strange pull, as if an unseen force urged her to read on. The house around her seemed to grow quieter, the shadows deepening as if they too were listening. That night, as the family slept, a low creak echoed through the house. It started softly, a gentle creak, but grew louder, more insistent. Emily stood, a dream filled with shadowy figures and hollow eyes. She tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered, a chill in the air that no blanket could warm. Downstairs, the creaking stopped. The house was silent once more, but the stillness was oppressive, a held breath. In the attic, the box lay open, its contents spilled out, and a faint whisper echoed through the empty halls. A soft, raspy voice repeating a single word. My. The Smiths awoke to an ordinary morning, unaware of the shift in the house's atmosphere. But as Emily went about her day, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She found herself glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see something just out of sight. The house seemed to hum with an energy she couldn't quite place, a low vibration that buzzed in her bones. As the days passed, strange noises became more frequent, whispers in the night, faint footsteps when no one was there, and shadows that moved of their own accord. The Smiths dismissed it as the house settling, but Emily knew better. She felt it in her gut, a primal fear that clawed at her sanity. The house was alive, and it was waiting. One evening, as Emily sat in her room, she heard the creaking again, this time louder, more urgent. It started in the attic, a slow creak, and moved down the stairs, each step echoing through the house. The Smiths gathered in the foyer, confusion etched on their faces. But as they watched, the lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. In the blackness, a presence stirred, ancient and malevolent. The pale mother had found a new family to claim, and the cycle began anew. The house, once empty, was now home to a horror beyond comprehension, and the Smiths were just the beginning. As the darkness closed in, the only sound was the creaking, now a relentless creak. Creak, a countdown to the terror that awaited them all. The chains of Sable House. The town of Ashwood was a place where secrets clung to every cracked sidewalk and rusted street lamp. It was a town where everyone knew each other's names, but few knew each other's truths. At the edge of this town stood Sable House, a sprawling mansion that loomed like a skeletal giant over the overgrown fields. For decades, its grandeur had been swallowed by decay, its windows shattered, and its front door hanging crookedly on hinges that creaked in the wind. But it wasn't the house itself that scared people. It was the stories. Some said Sable House was cursed, a place where the living was not welcome. Others claimed it was a site of forgotten rituals, where shadowy figures once gathered to summon forces best left unspoken. Lena had always dismissed it as small-town gossip. That was until her brother Owen went missing. Lena was a journalist, the kind of person who thrived on uncovering secrets. She and Owen had grown up together, but after their parents died in a car accident when Lena was 16, the two drifted apart. Owen became withdrawn and obsessed with the supernatural, while Lena threw herself into her work, determined to make a name for herself. But when Owen's cryptic voicemail came through, something in his voice made her blood run cold. "Lena, I found it," Owen had whispered, his voice trembling. "Sable House. It's not what I thought. It's alive. Don't let it chain you." The line went dead, replaced by static that crackled like fire. Lena tried calling back, but Owen's phone went straight to voicemail. The locals said he had been seen walking towards Sable House the night before, carrying a camera and a dusty old book about necromancy. That was 3 days ago. Determined to find her brother, Lena gathered a group of people she trusted, or at least tolerated. There was Caleb, her best friend since childhood, a skeptic who didn't believe in ghosts, but believed in Lena. Then there was Ava, her distant cousin, who had a knack for the supernatural and a collection of tarot cards she insisted on bringing. Lastly, there was Isaac, Owen's old friend and a self-proclaimed ghost hunter, who arrived with enough equipment to fill a paranormal investigation lab. "I don't like this," Caleb muttered as they stood outside Sable House. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, but the house seemed to absorb the light, standing as a stark, ominous silhouette. "Come on, Caleb," Lena said, adjusting the flashlight in her hand. "We can't just leave Owen out here. Whatever happened to him, we'll figure it out." Ava, who had been quiet until now, looked up from her tarot cards. "The cards don't lie, Lena. There's something in there. Something that doesn't want us to leave." "Great," Isaac said, rolling his eyes. Here we go with the spooky vibes again. Lena ignored them both and pushed open the creaking front door. The air inside was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of rot and decay. Cobwebs clung to the chandelier, swaying faintly as if something had brushed against them. "This place gives me the creeps," Caleb whispered, his voice echoing in the empty foyer. "And me," Ava agreed, her voice barely audible. Isaac, ever the skeptic, pressed forward, flipping on a high-powered flashlight. "Let's get this over with. If Owen's here, we'll find him." But as they stepped further into the house, the door slammed shut behind them. "What the—" Isaac started spinning around. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. "It's just the wind," she lied, but her voice trembled. The first few hours passed without much incident. They explored the house, finding little more than empty rooms and scattered debris. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere shifted. Doors creaked open on their own, and faint whispers echoed through the halls. At first, they dismissed it as the wind or the old house settling, but then they started hearing footsteps, light, deliberate footsteps that seemed to follow them. And then there were the visions. Lena was the first to see them. She had wandered into a long, narrow hallway, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the light flickered and died. When it came back on, she was standing in a completely different room. Or at least she thought she was. The room was filled with chains. Thick, rusted chains that hung from the ceiling like grotesque chandeliers. At the end of each chain was a figure, twisted, unnatural forms with their eyes sewn shut and their mouths stretched into silent screams. Lena gasped, her breath catching in her throat, and then the vision faded. She was back in the hallway, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Guys," she called out, her voice shaky. "You need to see this." But when the others arrived, the hallway was empty. As the night wore on, the visions grew stronger. Caleb saw shadowy figures darting around corners, their movements jerky and unnatural. Ava heard whispers in her ear when no one was there, the voice speaking in a language she didn't understand. And Isaac, tough, skeptical Isaac, found a blood-stained journal hidden in a dusty corner of the library. The journal belonged to someone named Malachi, a man who had lived in Sable House over a century ago. His writings were cryptic, filled with ramblings about spirits, rituals, and the boundless hunger of something ancient. "He was into some dark stuff," Isaac said, flipping through the pages. "Necromancy, curses, stuff that'll give you nightmares." But Lena barely heard him. She had found something else, a camera, sitting on a shelf in the corner of the room. It was Owen's camera. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up. Caleb frowned. "That's Owen's. He must have left it here." Lena turned it on, the screen flickering to life. The footage showed Owen walking into Sable House, his flashlight casting the same eerie shadows they had seen. He walked through the foyer, the camera shaking slightly in his hand. "Look," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It's not just a house, it's a prison or a trap. I don't know, but I can feel it watching me." The footage continued, showing Owen exploring the house. But as he walked, the shadows seemed to twist around him, moving even when he wasn't. "There," Owen breathed, pointing the camera at something off-screen. "Do you see that? It's moving. It's alive." The screen went black. Lena's hands were shaking. "We have to find him," she said, her voice firm. "No." As they delved deeper into the house, the visions grew more vivid. Lena began to hear Owen's voice, pleading, crying, sometimes laughing in a way that made her skin crawl. It was Owen, but it wasn't. There was something else in his voice, something darker, something that didn't belong. And then they found him. He was in a room at the very heart of the house, a room filled with chains that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Owen was standing in the center of the room, his eyes open but unseeing. He was speaking, but the words weren't his. "Welcome home," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've been waiting." "Owen," Lena whispered, stepping forward. "Is that you?" Owen's head snapped toward her, his eyes flickering with something otherworldly. "Lena," he said, his voice breaking. "Run." But it was too late. The chains began to move, slithering across the floor like snakes. They wrapped around Isaac's ankles, jerking him off his feet with a sickening crack. He screamed as they dragged him across the floor, his fingers clawing at the ground. "Let him go," Lena shouted, rushing forward. But Owen, or whatever was inside him, laughed. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice echoing in her mind. "Now you'll never leave." The chains lunged at Caleb, wrapping around his wrists. He fought, but they were too strong. As Lena watched in horror, the chains began to tighten, their links digging into his skin. And then there was Ava. She had been quiet until now, her eyes wide with terror. "Lena," she whispered, grabbing Lena's hand. "I think it's me. I think I'm the one it wants." Before Lena could respond, Ava stepped forward, her eyes glazing over. I'm sorry," she said, her voice distant. "I couldn't let you die, Lena. Any of you." The chains lunged at her, wrapping around her body. She didn't scream, didn't struggle. She just smiled sad, hollow smile, and closed her eyes. As the chains tightened, Lena felt a wave of darkness wash over her. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat. And then everything went black. When Lena came to, she was alone. The house was silent, the chains still, the room empty. But as she stumbled through the dark, she realized that the door was open. The front door, which had slammed shut when they arrived, was now wide open, bathed in the pale light of dawn. And then she heard a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Lena," it said, "you should have listened." She turned to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The floor beneath her seemed to shift, trapping her in place. And then the chains came, wrapping around her wrists and ankles. The house had been chosen. As the chains tightened, Lena realized that some places are never meant to be revisited. And Sable House was one of them. The missing brother. The town of Eldermere slept under a blanket of darkness, its streets lined with flickering streetlights that cast long shadows. The old Victorian homes seemed to lean in, as if sharing secrets, their windows like empty eyes staring back. On the outskirts of this quiet town stood Sable House, a mansion so shrouded in mystery that even the bravest of souls avoided it. Its towering spires reached toward the moon like skeletal fingers, and its blackened windows seemed to suck in the light around them, swallowing it whole. Lena Grant sat in her small apartment, the glow of her computer screen lighting up her pale face. She was a journalist, known for her relentless pursuit of the truth, especially when it came to the strange and unexplained. But tonight her curiosity wasn't driven by a story. It was driven by fear. Her phone lay on the desk, the screen cracked from years of use, but the voicemail that had come in an hour ago still echoed in her mind. "Lena." The voice on the other end was familiar, yet distorted, as if the words were being pulled through static. "Don't let it chain you." The line went dead. No goodbye, no explanation. Just static. Lena's heart pounded as she played the message again, her thumb hovering over the speaker button as if expecting a different outcome. But the same words echoed back, sending a shiver down her spine. It was Owen's voice. Her brother, her estranged brother. Their relationship had always been complicated. Owen had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when they were teenagers, and their parents had struggled to cope. Lena had always felt like she was walking on eggshells around him, never knowing when a conversation would turn into an argument or when he would disappear for days at a time. But despite everything, she loved him. He was her brother, and she couldn't lose him. Now, he was missing. Lena's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unknown number. "Hey, went into Sable House." You know he wouldn't listen. The message was cryptic, but Lena knew exactly who had sent it. It was Mira, the owner of the local gas station. Mira had a reputation for knowing everything about everyone in Eldermere. She also had a reputation for being superstitious, often warning people away from Sable House. Lena grabbed her coat and stepped out into the cold night air, the chill biting at her cheeks. She walked quickly to the gas station, the neon sign flickering above her as she pushed through the door. The bell above it let out a tired jingle. Mira was behind the counter, her silver hair pulled back into a tight braid, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "You know what that place is," she said before Lena could even speak. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if she feared being overheard. "A haunted house?" Lena scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Come on, Mira. There's got to be a logical explanation." But Mira just shook her head. "That house isn't haunted, Lena. It's alive. And it doesn't let people leave." Lena felt a flicker of doubt, but she pushed it aside. She had always prided herself on being rational, on not believing in ghost stories or curses. But Owen was missing, and the only lead she had was Sable House. "Do you know what happened to him?" Lena asked, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. Mira hesitated, then nodded. "He came in here 3 days ago. He was different. He had this look in his eyes, like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. He bought a camera and a book about the history of this town. He was obsessed with Sable House, kept talking about rituals and chains." Lena frowned. "Rituals? Chains?" That didn't sound like Owen. He had always been fascinated by the supernatural, but this sounded different. This sounded dangerous. "And then what?" Lena pressed, her patience wearing thin. "He left," Mira said simply. "And he didn't come back. But Lena, you can't go in there. That house, it's not safe." Lena sighed, pulling her coat tighter around her. "I have to find him, Mira. He's my brother." Mira's expression softened, and for a moment Lena saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "Be careful, Lena. That house has a way of getting inside your head." Lena nodded, but she was already turning to leave. She knew what she had to do. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and texts. Lena gathered a group of people she trusted. Her best friend, Caleb, who had a knack for staying calm under pressure. Her distant cousin, Ava, who knew more about folklore than anyone she'd ever met. And Isaac, Owen's old friend, who had a dark sense of humor but a loyalty that ran deep. None of them wanted to go, but none of them could turn their backs on Lena either. As they stood outside Sable House, the towering mansion loomed over them, its windows like empty eyes staring back. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the ancient trees that surrounded the house, creating an unsettling whisper that seemed to follow them as they approached the front door. "This feels wrong," Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted toward the house, her hands clutching a small bag of herbs and charms she had insisted on bringing. "Come on," Lena said, pushing open the creaking front door. "We're not going to find anything standing out here." The others hesitated, but eventually they followed her inside. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. Lena spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. "Great start," Isaac muttered, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Real reassuring." Lena shot him a look, but before she could say anything, Caleb stepped forward, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Let's just focus on finding Owen, okay?" The house was cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. Every step they took echoed, and the silence between them was oppressive, like a weight pressing down on their chests. As they moved deeper into the house, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she couldn't help but wonder if Mira had been right. Maybe Sable House was alive, and maybe it was waiting for them. The creak of the old wooden door echoed through the empty hallway like a groan from a tired giant. Lena pushed it open, her flashlight casting long shadows that danced on the peeling walls. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of decay, a smell that made her wrinkle her nose. Her friends, Caleb, Ava, and Isaac, followed closely, their breaths visible in the chill of the evening air. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Caleb whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he clutched his camera tightly to his chest. His eyes darted around the dimly lit room as if expecting something to jump out at him. "We have to find Owen," Lena replied firmly, stepping inside. Her voice echoed off the high ceiling, making it sound braver than she felt. The house loomed around them, its silence oppressive, like a weight pressing on their shoulders. As they stepped further into the foyer, a sudden thud made them all jump. The front door slammed shut behind them, the sound reverberating through the empty space. Lena's heart raced as she tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Great," Just great, Ava muttered, her voice laced with panic. She leaned against the door as if willing it to open. We're trapped. Stay calm, Isaac said, his voice steady. He adjusted his glasses and looked around. There has to be another way out. The group stood frozen for a moment, their breaths the only sound. Then, without a word, Lena led them deeper into the house. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, each step sounding like a hollow drumbeat. As they moved through the house, strange noises began to emerge. A faint whisper, like a soft breeze through dry leaves, followed them. Caleb spun around, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "No," Lena lied, trying to keep her voice steady. But she had heard it, a low, rasp-like sound that sent shivers down her spine. The rooms were filled with remnants of a life long past. Dust-covered furniture stood like sentinels, their shapes obscured by cobwebs. In the corner of one room, a vase teetered on the edge of a table, then fell with a crash, shattering into 100 pieces. The group gasped, their hearts pounding. "Who's there?" Isaac called out, his voice firm. There was no answer, just the echo of his words. Lena's flashlight landed on something red on the floor. She knelt down, her hand reaching out hesitantly. "Isaac, look at this." Isaac joined her, his face grim. It was a journal, its pages blood-stained and torn. He opened it carefully, the pages crackling with age. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The journal was filled with handwritten notes, the words twisted and illegible in places. Symbols adorned the margins, drawn in what looked like blood. As he flipped through the pages, a passage caught his eye. "The house must be fed," he read aloud, his voice trembling. "It hungers, and only blood will suffice." Ava's gasp was sharp. "This is messed up. We need to get out of here." But as they turned to leave, they heard it again, that low breathing sound. This time it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from all around them, echoing off the walls. Suddenly, the lights on their phones flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The breathing grew louder, a rhythmic whoosh that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was then that they heard the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from upstairs. Lena grabbed Caleb's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "What do we do?" she whispered. But before he could answer, a door slammed shut somewhere above them, the sound making them all flinch. The house seemed to shift around them, the walls creaking like an old wooden ship. In the darkness, the group realized they were not alone. The house was alive, and it was watching them. Worse yet, it was waiting for them to make their next move. As the footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs, Lena knew they had to act fast. But where could they go? The house seemed to be shifting, the doors leading to new and terrifying places. They were trapped in a labyrinth of fear, with no clear escape. And then the lights flickered back to life, revealing a sight that made their blood run cold. On the wall opposite them, in letters that seemed to drip with malevolence, was a single word: welcome. Chained souls. The air inside the Sable house grew colder as the group ventured deeper, their breaths visible in the dim, flickering light of their flashlights. The walls seemed to press in around them, the shadows twisting into shapes that looked almost alive. Every creak of the wooden floorboards made them all jump, even though they tried to hide it. "Alwyn," Lena called out, her voice steady but tinged with a growing desperation. "Are you here? Answer me." At first there was only silence. Then faintly they heard a voice, distorted and far away. "Lena, don't come closer." "Owen!" she exclaimed, her grip on the flashlight tightening. "That's Owen. He's in here somewhere." The group moved forward, their hearts pounding in unison. They'd been exploring for what felt like hours, but the house seemed to shift and twist around them, making it impossible to keep track of time. Doors led to more corridors, and windows showed views that didn't match the outside they had seen earlier. It was as if the house itself was toying with them. As they turned a corner, Ava suddenly froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "What was that?" she whispered, her eyes darting back and forth. "What was what?" Caleb asked, his voice low and cautious. Ava shook her head. I don't know. I thought I saw something moving. It looked like me. Like you? Isaac repeated, raising an eyebrow. Not exactly, Ava corrected. It was my shape, my height, but it wasn't me, and it moved wrong, like unnatural. Lena frowned. We need to keep moving. Owen's voice is getting louder. They continued down the hallway, their lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air felt heavier now, like it was thick with something unseen. Then, abruptly, Owen's voice came again, louder this time. Help me, please. The sound sent a chill down Lena's spine. This way, she said, leading the group toward a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, as if waiting for them. As they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them, echoing through the room. The walls were lined with old, rusted chains, each one attached to a figure that had been twisted beyond recognition. The bodies were grotesque, their limbs elongated and their faces contorted in silent screams. The chains hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as if pulled by unseen hands. What the hell? Caleb muttered, his voice barely audible. Isaac stepped forward, his flashlight beam settling on one of the figures. These aren't people, he said, his voice shaking. They're something else. Something not human. Suddenly, Ava screamed. Look at that, she cried, pointing her flashlight to a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs and a head that seemed to twist in ways that defied logic. As they watched, the shadow began to move, mimicking Ava's movements exactly. When she took a step back, it took a step forward. When she raised her hand, it raised its own. Stop looking at it, Isaac shouted. Don't make eye contact. But it was too late. The shadow's face turned toward them, its features shifting until it looked almost like Ava. Then, impossibly, it grinned, too wide, too toothy, with far more teeth than a human mouth should ever have. Ava's flashlight dropped to the floor, the light flickering once before dying. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment no one moved. Then the chains began to rattle. At first, it was a soft clinking sound like metal brushing against metal, but the noise grew louder, more insistent, until it became a deafening cacophony. The chains were moving on their own, the links scraping against the walls as they slithered across the floor like living things. Get out of here, Lena yelled, grabbing Ava's arm and pulling her toward the door. No! But the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, covered in the same rusted chains that lined the room. The group spun around, frantically searching for another way out, but there was none. They were trapped. And then they heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around them, echoing off the walls. You shouldn't have come here, it hissed. Now you'll never leave. As the chains began to creep closer, curling around the group like living nooses, Lena realized that her brother's voice was no longer the only one they could hear. There were others now, dozens of voices, all whispering together in a chaotic, incoherent chorus of pain and despair. Find Owen, Lena said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her. If he's here, we need to find him before it's too late. But as they turned to face the darkness, they saw him. Owen was standing in the center of the room, his eyes wide and unfocused. He was muttering to himself, his voice low and unintelligible. But it was his expression that terrified them most. His eyes were black, completely black, as if the irises had been swallowed whole by his pupils. And his mouth was twisted into a smile that was not his own. Owen? Lena called softly, her heart pounding. Owen, it's me. It's Lena. You need to come with us. For a moment he didn't respond. Then, slowly, his head turned toward them, his black eyes locked on Lena's face. I've been waiting, he said, his voice low and gravelly, not at all like the brother Lena knew. I've been waiting for you. And then Owen began to move toward them. The whispering chains. The air inside the sable house was thick with the scent of decay, each breath a reminder of the rot that clung to its walls. Lena's flashlight flickered as she stepped into the dusty room, the beam dancing across cobweb-draped corners. Her heart pounded, a relentless drumbeat in her ears as she spotted Owen's camera lying on the floor, its black casing marred by scratches. She knelt down, her knees pressing into the cold wood, and picked it up. The camera felt heavier than it should, as if weighed up by secrets. Turning it on, the screen flickered to life, casting an eerie glow on her face. The footage began, showing Owen's determined strides as he entered the mansion. But as the minutes passed, the video abruptly cut to static, leaving only silence. Owen never left. Lena's breath caught, her mind racing. The group gathered around, their faces illuminated by the dim light. "He never came out," she whispered, the words hanging heavy in the air. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. "We need to keep moving," he urged, but his voice wavered, betraying the fear he tried to hide. As they ventured deeper, the house seemed to shift around them, walls closing in like a vice. Each step creaked, a symphony of wood and shadows. Then the whispers began, soft, indistinct murmurs that grew louder, more insistent. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their breaths shallow and synchronized. Isaac, ever the skeptic, pushed ahead, but his resolve crumbled when a shadowy figure darted past his peripheral vision. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Ava shook her head, her ponytail swishing. "It's just the house playing tricks." But the tricks were only beginning. Caleb lagged behind, his ears straining to catch a familiar voice. "Babushka?" he whispered, his heart pounding. The voice grew clearer, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, each word a knife twisting in his gut. He spun around, but there was no one there. The voice echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of his grandfather's stories about restless spirits. Isaac, meanwhile, faced his own demon. A spectral figure coalesced before him, resembling his father. "I left because of you," it hissed, each word a slap. Isaac's eyes welled up, guilt and anger warring within him. Ava's reflection stared back at her from a broken mirror, her face distorting into grotesque grins. "You're just like me," it taunted, echoing her deepest fears of repeating her mother's mistakes. Lena's hallucinations were the most vivid. Owen appeared, his eyes black as coal, whispering her name. She reached out, but he vanished, leaving her clutching air. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of accusations and fears, each one a personal assault. The group's grip on reality faltered. Suspicions flared, accusations flew, and the once united friends teetered on the brink of chaos. The house fed on their fear, growing stronger with each fractured bond. In the chaos, the creaking of wooden floors and the rustle of unseen entities filled the air. Chains clinked faintly, a metallic echo that sent shivers down their spines. Symbols etched into the walls, pulsed with a malevolent glow, remnants of dark rituals that tied back to the house's necromantic past. As the hallucinations reached a fever pitch, the group realized they were being manipulated. The house was a predator, toying with their deepest fears. They needed to escape, but the ever-shifting labyrinth offered no clear path. Doors disappeared, corridors looped back, and the sound of chains grew louder, a relentless pursuit. In desperation, they pressed on, each step a battle against the house's intent. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, the chorus of the damned urging them forward. The line between reality and illusion blurred, and the group's resolve was tested. Finally, they found Owen, but he was no longer their brother. His eyes were empty, his voice a hollow echo. "I had to leave," he murmured, but the words were not his own. The house spoke through him, its presence ancient and hungry. The group froze, horror etched on their faces. They had uncovered the truth, but it came at a cost. The house demanded a sacrifice, a life to feed its hunger. The chains loomed, crawling towards them like living vines, each linking a promise of entrapment. In the end, it was not a choice, but an inevitability. One must stay, a pawn in the house's twisted game. As the chains tightened, the group faced an unbearable truth. Sable House never lets go. One must stay. The air inside Sable House grew colder, the shadows twisting like living things as the group ventured deeper into its belly. Lena clutched the flashlight tightly, its beam flickering as if it too feared the darkness. Caleb walked close behind her, his breathing steady but shallow, while Ava and Isaac trailed behind, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. Every step felt heavier, as though the house itself was resisting their presence. "Guys," Isaac whispered suddenly, his voice trembling. "Look at this." He stopped in front of a wall, his flashlight illuminating a message scrawled in what looked like blood. The letters were jagged and uneven, as though clawed into the plaster. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean?" she murmured, though she already knew the answer deep in her gut. "Rituals," Isaac said, his voice low. "In the journal I found earlier, there were mentions of sacrifices. The people who performed the rituals here, they fed the house with human lives to keep it alive." "Fed it?" Caleb repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "You mean they killed people?" Isaac nodded grimly. "And not just that. They bound their spirits to the house, trapping them here. The house doesn't just feed on flesh, it feeds on souls." Before anyone could respond, a voice echoed through the hallway. "Lena." It was Owen's voice, clear and unmistakable. Lena's heart leaped, hope surging through her. "Owen," she called back, her voice ringing through the empty halls. "Where are you?" "Follow my voice," he replied, his tone faint but urgent. "Hurry." Without hesitation, Lena led the group forward, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. They turned a corner, and there he was, Owen, standing in the middle of a grand room with a high, vaulted ceiling. His back was to them, and his shoulders were slouched as if he carried the weight of the world. "Owen," Lena whispered, relief washing over her. She stepped forward, ready to throw her arms around him, but something stopped her. His posture seemed wrong. His movements, too, were stiff and jerky, like a puppet on a string. "Lena," Owen said again, his voice low and gravelly, nothing like the brother she knew. Slowly he turned to face them. Lena's blood ran cold. Owen's eyes were black as coal. His pupils were swallowed entirely by the darkness. His skin was deathly pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his lips were pulled into a grotesque grin that didn't belong to him. He was Owen, yet he wasn't. Something else looked out through his eyes, something ancient and malevolent. "Owen," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "What's happened to you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his movements unnatural and twitchy, as though he was struggling to control his own body. "She's here," he said, his voice a mixture of his own and something else, something that sent shivers down their spines. "She's been waiting." "Who's here?" Caleb demanded, stepping in front of Lena as if to shield her. "What are you talking about?" Owen's grin widened, his black eyes glinting with something sinister. "The house," he said. "It's hungry." Before anyone could react, Owen lunged at them, his hands clawing at the air like talons. "You shouldn't have come here," he screamed, his voice a mixture of fear and fury. "Now you'll never leave." Caleb grabbed Lena by the arm and yanked her back just in time. Owen's nails raked across the wall, leaving deep gouges in the plaster. His movements were wild and unpredictable, as though he was no longer in control of his own body. The sound of his nails scraping against the wall sent a shiver down Lena's spine. Scritch, 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 a sound that echoed in her ears long after he stopped. "Owen, stop," Lena pleaded, her voice breaking. "It's me. It's Lena." For a moment, Owen froze. His black eyes flickered, and a glimmer of his true self peeked through like a candle flickering in the wind. "Lena," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Run, while you still can." But it was too late. Whatever had taken hold of him surged back to the surface, and he lunged again, his movements faster and more violent. The group scattered, dodging his wild attacks as he slammed into walls and furniture with inhuman strength. "He's not Owen anymore," Isaac shouted, grabbing a nearby chair and holding it up like a shield. "We need to get out of here. Now." But Lena had hesitated. She couldn't leave her brother behind no matter what he had become. Well, you can't just abandon him," she cried, her voice echoing through the room. Caleb grabbed her arm again, his grip tight. We have to. He's gone, Lena. Whatever that thing is, it's not your brother. Before she could argue, a loud crash echoed through the room. Owen had slammed his fist into a mirror, shattering it into 100 sharp shards. He turned to face them, his black eyes gleaming with malice. You can't leave, he growled, his voice no longer human. The house won't let you. As if on cue, the doors slammed shut behind them, and the sound of locks clicking into place echoed through the room. Click, click, click. The walls began to shift, the floor trembling beneath their feet. The house was alive, and it was closing in on them. We have to get out of here, Ava screamed, her voice high-pitched with panic. But it was too late. The room was sealing itself off, the walls closing in like a vise. Owen, or whatever was controlling him, laughed, the sound deep and guttural. You should have listened, he said, his black eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. And then everything went dark. When the light flickered back on, the room was silent. Owen was gone, and in his place was a single unspoken truth. They were trapped. The house had made its choice, and one of them would have to pay the price. The final choice. The air in the dimly lit chamber was thick with the scent of decay, and something sweetly metallic, like old blood. Lena, Caleb, Ava, and Isaac stood in a circle, their breaths shallow and synchronized. The walls around them were lined with ancient symbols, etched deep into the plaster, pulsing faintly with a sickly green glow. The chains that bound Owen, now a shadow of his former self, hung slack, but the room felt alive, the walls breathing like the slow, deliberate inhales of something ancient and malevolent. Owen, or what was once Owen, stood at the center of the room, his eyes black as coal, his voice a low, raspy whisper. The house must be fed, he intoned, his words barely recognizable as his own. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though something inside him was fighting to get out. The chains around him seemed to twitch and coil, like snakes alive and restless. Lena stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. Let him go. Take me instead. She had always been the strong one, the one to take charge, but now her voice betrayed her fear. The others turned to her, their faces pale and etched with terror. Caleb reached out, his hand brushing against her, but she pulled away. We can't lose anyone else, she said, her eyes fixed on Owen. I have to try. Ava shook her head, her dark hair swinging wildly. No, Lena, you can't just... But before she could finish, the house interrupted. It didn't speak in words, but in sounds, low creaks and groans, like the shifting of old wooden bones. The chains around Owen rattled, their metal links scraping against each other with a sound like teeth chattering. The ground beneath them trembled, and for a moment it felt as though the entire house was holding its breath. Then, in silence, a voice boomed, echoing off the walls. It was deep, guttural, and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. One must stay, it growled. One must feed the house. The group exchanged glances, their eyes wide with fear. Isaac clenched his fists, his jaw tight. We're not leaving anyone behind, he said, his voice steady, though his hands shook. But the house was insistent. The chains around Owen began to move, slithering across the floor like living vines. They wrapped around the group's ankles, pulling tight. Caleb yelped in pain as one of the chains dug into his skin. Let go, he shouted, kicking at the metal coils, but they only tightened. Lena fell to her knees, her hands grasping at the chain around her leg. We have to listen, she cried, her voice rising above the noise. We have to make a choice. Ava suddenly stood up. Her eyes were wild. I'll do it, she said, her voice firm. I'll take Owen's place. No, Lena screamed, but Ava was already moving. She stepped forward, her hands outstretched. Let them go, she said to the house. Take me instead. The house responded with a sound like a sigh, long and drawn out, filled with a strange, otherworldly relief. The chains around the group's legs loosened, retracting with a rattling clang. Owen's chains, however, tightened, pulling him back into the shadows. His voice, barely audible, whispered, "Thank you." But as Ava stepped closer to the center of the room, Lena felt a cold dread creeping over her. Something wasn't right. The house's voice came again, its tone almost mocked. "The choice is made." As the words faded, the room began to shift. The walls seemed to close in, the symbols on them glowing brighter. The air grew colder, and the darkness felt heavier, like a physical presence pressing down on them. Ava stood at the center now, her hands trembling. "I did it," she whispered, looking back at Lena. "I saved you." But Lena's eyes were fixed on the shadows. Owen was gone, but something else was there. Something ancient, patient, and hungry. The house had been playing them all along. It hadn't wanted just anyone. It had wanted Lena. And now, it had her. As the realization hit her, the chains around Ava began to tighten. They wrapped around her arms and legs, pulling her back into the darkness. She screamed, her voice echoing through the room, but it was cut short. The chains pulled her into the shadows, and she was gone. Lena stumbled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ava!" she shouted, but there was no answer. The house's voice came again, its tone triumphant. "The chains are tightened." And in the darkness, something laughed. A low, deep, guttural sound that made Lena's blood run cold. She turned to run, but the door was gone. The walls had shifted, and she was alone in a room that seemed to stretch endlessly. As she ran, the house whispered her name. "Lena, Lena, you belong here now." She didn't dare look back. She knew what she would see. The chains, the shadows, the house's endless hunger. She kept running, but the walls kept shifting, leading her deeper into the heart of Sable House. And in the darkness, the house waited. Patient, hungry, and eternal. The chains were tightening, and Lena was running out of time. The chains tightened. Lena's eyelids fluttered open, her mind foggy as if draped in a thick, impenetrable mist. The air was heavy, stale, and she could taste the dust coating her tongue. Groggily, she lifted her head, wincing at the sharp, throbbing pain in her temples. The room was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ache, as if even the air itself was holding its breath. Her gaze darted around, trying to piece together where she was and how she had gotten there. She was alone. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her friends, Caleb, Ava, Isaac, were nowhere to be seen. Owen was gone, too. The room was dimly lit by the faintest sliver of light seeping through a grimy window. The walls, once a pristine white, were now streaked with age and grime, their paint peeling off in curled, brittle sheets. The floor creaked softly under her as she shifted, the sound echoing unnervingly in the emptiness. "Hello!" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. It felt wrong to speak aloud here, as if she were disturbing something that should remain undisturbed. The only response was the faint hum of the wind outside, its mournful sigh creeping through the cracks in the walls like a lost soul. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her, but she forced herself to move. She had to find her friends, had to find Owen. The house seemed to stretch endlessly around her, its corridors twisting and turning in ways that felt impossible. Every step she took echoed too loudly, as if the house itself were listening to her every move. As she moved through the halls, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty. Unseen eyes were on her, bored into her skin, studying her. She quickened her pace, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. Every door she opened led to more questions, more terrors. Some rooms were filled with the stench of rot, while others were disturbingly clean, as if they'd been prepared for her arrival. She found the entrance hall eventually, the grand chandelier hanging crookedly, its crystals dulled by years of grime. The front door was open, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Sunlight spilled through the gap, golden and inviting. But when Lena reached out to touch the door frame, she felt it. A cold, unyielding force, like an invisible hand pressing against her chest. She tried to step forward, to run, but it was no use. The house would not let her leave. You can't go, a voice murmured, low and gravelly, like stones shifting in the earth. Lena spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from all around her, echoing off the walls. You belong here now. Who are you? She demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Where are my friends? The house didn't answer. Instead, it seemed to hum, a deep, vibrating sound that resonated in her bones. The air around her grew colder, the shadows twisting into shapes that made her skin crawl. She could feel the weight of the house's history pressing down on her, the accumulated misery and fear of all those who had come before her. Lena turned and ran, her feet pounding the stairs as she fled deeper into the house. She had to find her friends, had to find a way out. But every door she opened led her in circles, and every window she tried wouldn't budge. The house shifted and twisted, its layout seemingly changing before her eyes. She heard footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate, but whenever she turned, there was no one there. Then she heard the whispers. They started as a faint murmur, indistinct and distant, but they grew louder, more urgent, until she could make out the words. Lena, Lena, come and find us. The voice was Owen's, unmistakable, but it was wrong. It was distorted, stretched out, as if he were speaking from somewhere far away, or somewhere not quite of this world. She followed the sound, her heart heavy with dread. It led her to a door she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind a tattered tapestry. The door was old and rusted, its handle cold to the touch. When she pushed it open, a wave of icy air hit her, and she stumbled back, gasping. The room was small, dimly lit by flickering candles that seemed to dance in the drafts. And there, in the center of the room, was Owen. But it wasn't Owen. Not anymore. His eyes were black as coal, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. He smiled at her, but it wasn't his smile. It was wide and unnatural, stretching his mouth too far. Lena, he said, his voice echoing with the same distortion as the whispers. I've been waiting. She tried to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. Owen, or whatever had taken Owen, began to laugh, the sound sharp and grating. The air around him seemed to ripple, as if the very fabric of reality was bending to accommodate something that didn't belong. And then she saw it, a shadow, tall and formless, coalescing behind him. It moved like liquid, flowing and twisting in ways that defied logic. The shadow spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that made her blood run cold. You should have listened, it said. You should have stayed away. Lena tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The shadow reached out, its tendrils curling around her like chains. She felt a searing pain in her wrists and ankles, as if something was binding her, pulling her closer to Owen. The house was alive, and it was hungry. As the darkness closed in around her, Lena realized the truth. She wasn't just trapped in Sable House. She was a part of it now. The house had claimed to her, and it would never let her go. The last thing she heard was Owen's laughter, echoing in her mind long after everything else had gone black. The insignificant flaw. Sarah, a meticulous architect teetering on the edge of 30, wasn't just organized. She was meticulously structured. Her life was a blueprint of order and precision, from the geometrically perfect arrangement of her minimalist furniture to the time-to-the-second preparation of her meals. This obsessive control wasn't just a quirk. It was a self-imposed shield, a bulwark against the past trauma that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. A past shrouded in the unsettling silence following her sister's disappearance years ago, a silence her family never spoke of. Her sanctuary, a small apartment in a pre-war building downtown, was the physical manifestation of this control. It was her safe space, her perfectly curated bubble, until the crack appeared. It started as if nothing, a faint hairline fractured on the ceiling above her bed. Sarah initially dismissed it as a minor imperfection, easily plastered over and forgotten. But the crack stubbornly returned, each time a little longer, a little wider, a little different. It was as if the apartment itself was rejecting her attempts at perfection. Annoyance spiraled into obsession. Sarah spent hours studying the crack, documenting its insidious growth with meticulous notes and photographs. The click of the camera shutter became a constant soundtrack to her anxiety. She consulted with a parade of contractors, each offering conflicting diagnoses, each seeding further unease. One muttered about structural instability. Another whispered of old curses and restless spirits passing down from the previous owner of the house before it was sold. Sarah started feeling like the crack was a secret she cannot possibly know. As the crack snaked its way across the ceiling, Sarah's paranoia blossomed. Vivid nightmares plagued her sleep, filled with distorted faces and unsettling whispers that echoed her sister's name. Shadows danced in the periphery of her vision, playing tricks on her sleep-deprived mind. The drip, drip of some unknown liquid seemed to emanate from the crack, a constant, maddening reminder. Was she hallucinating? Was her fractured mental state finally giving way, conjuring demons from the depths of her subconscious? Or was the crack a sign of something far more sinister, an opening to something unspeakable lurking just beyond the veil of reality? Her family thinks she is losing her mind and tells her to see a psychiatrist, but Sarah thinks she is perfectly sane. She just knows that something is terribly wrong. Sarah feels like her close friend Claire is the only person who believes in her and supports her through all of this. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Sarah delved deeper, chasing whispers and rumors connected to the building's history. She discovered a dark past, tales of secret societies, occult rituals, and a string of unexplained disappearances, including her missing sister, Lily. The more she uncovered, the more the lines blurred between reality and nightmare, between sanity and madness. The hairline fracture. The clock ticked, a rhythmic tick-tock, tock. That echoed in Sarah's meticulously organized apartment. Everything was in its place. The Bauhaus-inspired sofa perfectly aligned with the Persian rug. The stack of architectural journals arranged by date on the glass coffee table. The minimalist art prints hung with laser-straight precision. Even the air felt controlled, filtered and dehumidified to a constant 68 degrees. This order, this rigid structure, was Sarah's sanctuary, her bulwark against the past she desperately tried to contain. She was in her late 20s, a rising star in the architectural world, known for her sharp eye and even sharper mind. But behind the crisp professional exterior lurked a fragility, a vulnerability born from a childhood tragedy she rarely spoke of, even to herself. The control she exerted over her surroundings was a desperate attempt to keep the chaos at bay, to prevent the past from seeping into the present. Tonight, though, the clock's steady rhythm seemed to mock her efforts. A subtle unease prickled at the back of her neck as she settled in for the night. After double-checking the locks on the windows and the front door, a habit she couldn't shake, she finally climbed into bed, switching off the bedside lamp. Darkness enveloped the room, a comforting blanket that usually lulled her to sleep, but not tonight. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed something. A faint, almost imperceptible line marred the smooth, white expanse of the ceiling directly above her bed. A crack. It was barely visible, a subtle aberration in the perfect white canvas. Like a spider's silk stretched thin, it ran for maybe 6 inches, a mere blemish. It itched at the edges of her vision, a tiny imperfection in her carefully curated world. Ridiculous, she muttered to herself, reaching for her phone. She squinted at the screen, the bright light stinging her eyes. Switching on the bedside lamp, she climbed out of bed for a closer look. It was a crack, a hairline fracture, barely wider than a human hair. Sarah felt a surge of annoyance, a minor tremor in her carefully constructed calm. It had to be dealt with. Now. She grabbed a step-ladder from the closet, another meticulously chosen piece, foldable and lightweight, and carefully positioned it beneath the crack. Climbing up, she examined it closely. The plaster around the crack seemed slightly discolored, a faint grayish hue that wasn't there before. Probably just settling, she reasoned, trying to dismiss her growing unease. Old buildings did that. But this apartment building, a renovated Art Deco masterpiece, was relatively new. She knew the construction company that had done the remodeling, Meticulous, reliable, reputable. It shouldn't be settled. Still, she tried to ignore the prickling unease. She'd call maintenance in the morning. They'd patch it up, paint over it, and everything would be back to normal. Order restored. Descending from the ladder, Sarah took a photo of the crack with her phone. It was a habit she'd picked up from her job, documenting everything, meticulously recording every detail. Click, not foul. The camera shutter echoed in the silent room, the sound oddly amplified. Back in bed, Sarah tossed and turned. The image of the crack burned in her mind. She tried to focus on her work on the blueprints she was designing for a new eco-friendly skyscraper downtown. But the crack kept intruding, a persistent distraction. Finally, exhaustion won eye. She drifted off to sleep, but her dreams were troubled. She dreamt of ceilings collapsing, of gaping holes in the sky, of whispers carried on the wind. The next morning, the crack seemed worse. It wasn't just the crack itself, but the way the light caught it, casting a subtle shadow that seemed to writhe and twist. Sarah felt a distinct chill run down her spine. This wasn't just settling. This was something else. Hesitantly, she reached for her phone and dialed her mother, a woman she rarely confided in. Their relationship was strained, marked by years of unspoken grief and simmering resentment over what happened to her younger brother, David. "Mom, it's Sarah." Her voice sounded thin, almost reedy. "Sarah, what's wrong? You never call." Her mother's voice was sharp, laced with suspicion. "Nothing's wrong exactly. There's this crack in my ceiling, above my bed. It's unnerving." A pause. "A crack? Sarah, are you okay? Are you taking your medication?" Sarah bristled. "Mom, I'm fine. I just needed to talk to someone." "About a crack? Darling, you need to relax. Maybe see your therapist." The conversation ended abruptly. Sarah felt a wave of loneliness wash over her. Even her own mother thought she was losing it. As the days passed, the crack became an obsession. Sarah spent hours examining it, documenting its progress, taking more pictures. Click, click, click. The camera became her constant companion. She felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that something terrible was about to happen. The insignificant flaw had become a portal to something unknown, something malevolent. Her meticulously crafted world was beginning to crumble, and she was powerless to stop it. The measure of madness. The hairline fractured, barely noticeable yesterday, now resembled a faint scratch inflicted by a phantom claw across the pristine white ceiling. It was longer, perhaps only a millimeter, but in Sarah's meticulously ordered world, a millimeter was a mile. Last night's uneasy sleep, punctuated by a disjointed dream of falling through an endless white void, hadn't helped. The memory clung to her like morning fog. She grabbed her phone, the cool metal a small comfort against her clammy palm. Click, click, click. The camera shutter sliced through the morning silence as she documented the crack's evolution. Each photo was a painful acknowledgement that she wasn't imagining things. Then came the measurements. A steel ruler, usually reserved for precise architectural drawings, now pressed against the ceiling, recording the minuscule, yet terrifying progression. The numbers mocked her, small and innocent on their own, but weighted with dread in the context of the crack. Dismissing the crack became impossible. It's nothing," she muttered, the words hollow in the empty apartment. She knew it wouldn't be nothing. Not anymore. First, the contractors. She found 3 online, their promises of quick fixes and expert service grating on her nerves. The first, a burly man named Frank, arrived with a booming laugh and a toolbox overflowing with metal. After a cursory glance, he attributed it to settling and suggested a simple patch job. "Old buildings, you know. They breathe," he said, his words doing little to calm her nerves. The second, a younger woman with tired eyes and a pragmatic demeanor, offered a more unsettling diagnosis. "Could be a joist issue," she said, her voice low. "Might need to open up the ceiling to investigate. Could be expensive." She mentioned potential water damage, structural weaknesses, and a host of other problems that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. The third contractor was the worst. An elderly man named Mr. Abernathy with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. He didn't even touch the ceiling. He just stared at the crack, his face etched with an unreadable expression. After an unnervingly long silence, he whispered, Some things aren't meant to be fixed. Some houses remember." Then, with a cryptic shake of his head, he shuffled out the door, leaving Sarah colder than before. "Settling spirits," he'd mumbled to himself as he exited, the words echoing in her ears. Paranoia started to bloom in the fertile ground of her anxiety. A flicker of movement in the periphery, always gone when she turned to look. A sense of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She found herself checking the locks on the doors and windows, even though she knew she had secured them only moments before. Each creak of the old apartment building, each rustle of leaves outside her window, became a potential threat. One evening while working late on a project, she heard it. Drip, drip, drip. A slow, rhythmic sound coming from above her. Water, she assumed, leaking from the crack. But when she stood on a chair and pressed her ear to the ceiling, she heard something else beneath the dripping. A faint, almost inaudible whisper. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent a jolt of pure fear through her. She dismissed it as sleep deprivation, pushed it down with another cup of coffee. But the whispers persisted. They came at night, just before sleep, a chorus of voices just beyond the reach of conscious hearing. Then there was Mrs. Petrov, her neighbor from across the hall, an elderly woman with a perpetually worried expression and a cat named Shadow. Mrs. Petrov usually kept to herself, but one afternoon she stopped Sarah in the hallway. "That apartment," she began, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "Some places are never truly empty. This building, it has a history. Bad things happened here, a long time ago. You should be careful." Sarah tried to brush it off, attributing it to Mrs. Petrov's eccentricity. But the old woman's words lingered, adding another layer of unease to the already suffocating atmosphere. Later that night, Sarah decided to research the building's history. Online searches revealed little, only vague references to an incident in the 1930s and a series of unsolved disappearances. But then she stumbled upon an archived newspaper article mentioning a tenant named Alistair Blackwood, a known occultist who had lived in her very apartment. Rumors of strange rituals and whispered incantations swirled around him. He vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a locked room and a lingering sense of dread. The article sent a chill through her. She tried to tell herself it was just a story, a ghost story meant to scare gullible readers. But the image of Alistair Blackwood, a man who dabbled in the dark arts in her apartment, stuck in her mind, feeding her growing paranoia. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the drip, 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 and the whispers. She felt like she was losing her grip, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her, one insignificant millimeter at a time. The crack, she realized, wasn't just a flaw in the ceiling. It was a crack in her sanity, a fissure leading to something dark and unknown. And she was afraid of what she might find on the other side. Night terrors. The crack. It lived rent-free in Sarah's mind now, a constant, nagging presence. Sleep, once a sanctuary, had become a battleground. Every night, the same oppressive weight descended, a thick blanket of fear smothering any hope of rest. She tried everything, herbal teas, white noise, even counting sheep, which morphed into cracked skin to bleeding monstrosities in her imagination. Nothing worked. The nightmares began subtly. Distorted versions of her childhood home flickered in her subconscious, the familiar wallpaper peeling away to reveal grotesque, pulsating flesh beneath. Her grandmother, a sweet, gentle woman in life, would stand in the doorway, her eyes vacant, whispering cryptic warnings that faded into static before Sarah could decipher them. "Don't look behind the plaster, dear. Some things are best left buried." The voice, normally a comforting lilt, was raspy, like nails dragging across a chalkboard. Then they intensified. One night, she dreamt she was standing in her apartment, but the walls were made of stretching, elastic skin. She could hear a faint thrumming like a heartbeat, resonating from within the walls themselves. A voice, layered and discordant, echoed around her, closer, closer. She thrashed in bed, a strangled sob escaping her lips. The pulse beat faster. Thump, 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 thump. Sarah would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The digital clock on her nightstand glared at her, mocking her distress. 3:17 a.m. The witching hour, her subconscious whispered. She'd sit up, her gaze drawn inexorably to the ceiling. The crack, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the window, seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light of its own. A subtle, green shimmer. One night, fueled by desperation and a triple shot of espresso, a terrible idea she knew, she decided to stay awake. She sat in her armchair, a blanket wrapped tightly around her, watching the ceiling. Hour after hour ticked by. The silence in the apartment building was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old pipes. She was certain she could feel a presence with her in the room, a heavy, watchful entity. Around 2:00 a.m. she felt it. A cold draft snaked through the room, even though the windows were tightly sealed. Whumph. The sound was barely audible, like a distant explosion muffled by layers of cotton. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She focused on the crack in the ceiling. Then it happened. The crack began to glow. Not brightly, but a subtle, eerie luminescence, a sickly green color that seemed to writhe and pulse. From within the crack, she saw a faint image flicker. A distorted face, its features stretched and grotesque, seemed to stare back at her. Its eyes were pools of black, bottomless pits swallowing all light. Sarah gasped. A silent scream trapped in her throat. She scrambled back, knocking over a stack of books. "Thud!" The face vanished. The green glow faded. The crack was just a crack again. She lay on the floor, panting, convinced she was losing her mind. "It's just a dream," she muttered, clinging to the mantra like a lifeline. Just a vivid hallucination. But then she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft she couldn't be sure if it was real or just a figment of her exhausted imagination. It seemed to come from just above her, from the ceiling. "Sarah, help us." The voice was childlike, pleading. It sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Suddenly, a small object fell from the ceiling, landing with a soft plink on the wooden floor right next to her head. Sarah froze. She forced herself to look. It was a child's marble, a milky white glass orb, swirling with streaks of red. It looked old, worn, as though it had been clutched in a small hand for years. It looked familiar. Then a horrifying realization hit her. She hadn't registered it before, mired in her terror, but the marble was the same, its exact mirror reflection of one she used to own as a little girl. She remembers losing it. She can't remember where or how she lost it. A new wave of dread washed over her. Who was whispering her name? And why did that marble feel like a lost piece of herself, returned from the grave? The crack in the ceiling wasn't just a crack. It was something far more insidious. Something connected to her. And how? A truth that felt like it would break her if she ever found it. The neighbor's whisper. The throbbing behind Sarah's eyes was a relentless metronome, counting down to an inevitable break. Sleep had become a battlefield where nightmares waged war, leaving her raw and exhausted. She stumbled through her apartment, the once comforting order now a mocking reminder of her failing control. The precise angles of her furniture seemed to tilt, the pristine white walls closing in. She stared at the ceiling, the crack now a jagged scar bisecting the room above her bed. It had grown overnight, she was sure of it. The meticulous photographs she'd been taking, each time stamped and catalogued, served as concrete proof, or proof of her descent into madness. Was she truly seeing this, or was it some phantom limb of her repressed trauma clawing its way to the surface? Doubt gnawed at her. Maybe the contractors were right. Maybe it was just settling. Maybe she was exaggerating. But then she'd remember the green pulse she had seen emanating from the crack. A pulse of green she had seen when she had woken up in her sleep. She ventured out of her apartment. The hallway felt colder than usual, the air thick with a static electricity that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It was then she ran into Mrs. Dubois. Mrs. Dubois lived down the hall, a frail woman with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 100 years. Sarah usually avoided her. Mrs. Dubois had always given her the chills, the way the older woman stared at her, like she could see right through, like she knew her deepest secrets. "Rough night, dear." Mrs. Dubois' voice was a dry rustle, like autumn leaves skittering across the pavement. Sarah recoiled slightly. I didn't sleep well," she admitted, her voice barely whispering. Mrs. Dubois nodded slowly. "This old building, it has a way of keeping people awake. Walls have ears, you know, and some have mouths, too." Sarah frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The old woman leaned closer, her breath smelling faintly of mothballs and dust. "This building, it's not on stable ground, child. Not just physically. There are things that linger here. Echoes. Some places are never truly empty." Sarah's heart pounded. "What things?" she forced herself to ask, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. Mrs. Dubois' gaze sharpened, locking onto Sarah with unnerving intensity. "The first owner, a Mr. Abernathy. It used to throw lavish parties in this building. People said he was a collector of oddities, unusual books, strange artifacts, things best left alone." She paused, a wet cough rattling in her chest. Some whispered, "He dabbled in things he shouldn't have. Black magic, my dear. Things that open doors. To other places. Other things." Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine, colder this time. "Black magic. That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Mrs. Dubois chuckled softly, a reedy, mirthless sound. "Look around you, Sarah. Do you really think everything is as it seems?" Her eyes flicked upward, towards the ceiling of the hallway. "Some doors are best left unopened, child. And some cracks. They're not just cracks." She held on to her phone with a sweaty palm as she whispered under her breath, "You're saying that the crack, it's connected to Mr. Abernathy?" "Connected? No, dear. It is Mr. Abernathy. He did awful things down there. Those awful things will now be your burden to carry." Sarah, now filled with immense paranoia, broke away from Mrs. Dubois and quickly scurried into her apartment. She slammed the door shut, locking it and pressing her back against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air in her apartment felt heavier somehow, charged with an unseen energy. She looked at her ceiling. The crack. It was wider now, almost as if it had heard Mrs. Dubois' words. Driven by a desperate need to understand, Sarah went to her computer. For hours, she trawled through online archives, searching for anything about Mr. Abernathy, the building's history, anything that might shed light on what Mrs. Dubois had said. She found newspaper clippings mentioning the lavish parties, gossip columns hinting at Abernathy's eccentricities, but nothing concrete about black magic or occult practices. Then she found it. Buried deep in a historical society forum, a single cryptic post, Abernathy Mansion, a place of shadows and whispers. Legend says he sought to unlock the gates between worlds. Disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only rumors and a lingering darkness. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. A lingering darkness. Was that what she was feeling? Was that what was manifesting as the crack in her ceiling? She then heard a scraping sound from the ceiling. She paused. She heard it again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like fingernails scratching on wood. Terror gripped her. She backed away, her eyes fixed on the crack. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then, a low, guttural growl echoed from above. Sarah screamed. She scrambled back, tripping over a meticulously placed rug, her world turning upside down. As she fell, she saw it. A single dark shape pressing against the ceiling behind the crack. A shape that seemed to be struggling to get through. The air crackled with ozone layers, and the smell of sulfur filled the room. The insignificant flaw had become a doorway, and something was trying to come through. The unraveling. Sarah hadn't slept properly in days. The apartment, once her sanctuary of order, had become a prison of paranoia. Each sunrise brought not relief, but a deepening dread. The crack, it was consuming her. Her meticulously scheduled life had crumbled. No more precisely timed meals, no more perfectly aligned cushions. Her work as an architect suffered. Projects lay unfinished, blueprints dusty. All her energy was focused on the fissure snaking across her ceiling, a malignant vine drawing life from her sanity. It had grown bolder, wider, a chasm in the plaster. It wasn't just a hairline fracture anymore. Now it resembled a jagged lightning bolt frozen mid-strike, and it was spreading. Not with a quiet progression, but with audible crawling. She could hear it at night, a low, rasping sound like nails dragging across a chalkboard. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Sarah spent her days documenting its expansion. She'd climb onto her rickety stepladder, camera in hand, clicking away. Click, 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 die. Each photo a testament to her unraveling. The walls of her apartment were plastered with these images, a gruesome gallery of her obsession. Adding to her terror, the crack now seemed alive. It pulsed with a faint, unhealthy light, a sickly green that made her stomach churn. Sometimes, staring at it for too long, she thought she saw shapes within the darkness of the crack. Faces, swirling, distorted, reaching. Each time she looked, the shapes would be different. The contractors she'd consulted initially had stopped taking her calls. One, the older gentleman who'd spoken of settling spirits, had simply said, "Some things are best left alone, child," before hanging up. She tried to call, but the number was disconnected. Her neighbor, Mr. Henderson, the one with the unsettlingly yellow eyes and the ever-present smell of mothballs, had become even more cryptic. One afternoon, as Sarah was hauling trash bags filled with plaster shards, a futile attempt to contain the damage, he stopped her. "It feeds on fear, you know," he croaked, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "The more you worry, the stronger it gets, just like your mother." Sarah stopped dead in her tracks. "Stay away from my family, you don't know anything about my mother," she hissed, her voice trembling. Mr. Henderson simply smiled, a slow, unsettling curl of his lips. "Oh, but I do. She was always a fragile soul." "What did you say?" Sarah demanded, stepping closer, fear and anger warring within her. But Mr. Henderson just chuckled, a dry, wheezing sound, and shuffled back into his apartment. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the hallway. Sarah stared at the closed door, her heart pounding, the chill from his words settling deep in her bones. That night, the nightmares intensified. They weren't just distorted images anymore. They were memories, fragments of a childhood trauma she had long repressed. A car accident, a rain-slicked road, the blinding headlights, her mother's screams. Crunch. The crack on the ceiling morphed into the twisted metal of the wrecked car. The green light pulsed, mirroring the flashing emergency lights. The whispers in her dreams became her mother's voice, pleading, broken. "Sarah, help me." Sarah bolted upright in bed, soaked in sweat. The apartment was plunged into darkness, save the faint green glow emanating from the ceiling. She stumbled out of bed, her legs shaky, her vision blurry. She had to understand. Why was this happening? She dug through old files, searching for the building's history. Hours melted away as she pored over the documents. Land deeds, construction permits, old newspaper clippings. Finally, she found it. A small article tucked away in the archives, dated back to the early 1900s. A story about a series of strange occurrences in the building, unexplained fires, disappearances, whispers of occult practices. A dark secret had been unearthed regarding the building, she came to realize. Apparently, back in the early 20th century, before the building was razed, there were rumors of a coven of devil-worship witches. Sarah chuckled, trying to calm herself, but her heart was failing. The article mentioned a ritual gone wrong. A gateway opened, a darkness unleashed. But the article stopped abruptly. It was clear that whatever evil that once resided there was clearly back. Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. Was the crack on her ceiling a remnant of that ritual? A doorway to something else? As she stared at the article, a photograph fell out. It was a picture of the foundation being built for the apartment she lived in now. The picture showed the workers smiling and doing their duties professionally. However, if you look closely, you can see that in a small corner, that looked to be a summoning circle with symbols and candle stands. The light seemed to be reflecting off the symbols, and the picture was definitely not taken with flash. It was some kind of light from the symbols. Suddenly, a piercing scream ripped through the silence, echoing through the apartment. It wasn't her scream. It came from the hallway. A woman's voice, filled with pure terror. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice. Who? What was happening? The screaming stopped as abruptly as it began. Silence descended once more, thick and heavy, broken only by the scritch of the crack, growing ever wider, ever closer. As Sarah listened to the growing crack, she wondered if she was next. The horror behind the crack was coming out soon, and when it did, Sarah knew she would be facing it head-on. The threshold. Sarah hadn't slept properly in days. The reflection staring back from the darkened window was gaunt, haunted. Her meticulously applied makeup couldn't hide the dark circles blooming beneath her eyes, a testament to the relentless nightmares and the waking horror that had consumed her life. She picked at a loose thread on her once pristine comforter, her fingers trembling. Click, click, click. The sound of the ceiling fan became a metronome counting down to something. The crack had grown. It was no longer a hairline fracture. It was a jagged, angry scar crisscrossing the ceiling, almost glowing with a sickly internal light. It pulsed a slow, rhythmic thump that resonated in the very bones of her skull. Her head throbbed in sync. She had spent hours piecing together fragments of information. The cryptic warnings from Mrs. Henderson, the old woman down the hall. This building, it remembers things, bad things. The whispered mentions of rituals, of sacrifices in the building's early days. The old newspaper articles she'd unearthed, detailing a series of strange disappearances in the 1920s, dismissed as accidents, but now, through the cracked lens of her paranoia, seemed undeniably connected. But it wasn't just the historical fact. It was the feeling. The oppressive weight that hung in the air, the sense of being watched by something unseen. The faint, sulphurous smell that clung to the apartment no matter how much she cleaned. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A sound from within the walls. Tonight, Sarah felt compelled. She had to understand. Armed with a flashlight and a shaky resolve, she stood on her bed, facing inches from the malignant fissure. The air around it shimmered, distorting the light like heat rising from asphalt. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. Suddenly, a gust of cold air swept through the room despite the closed windows. The flashlight flickered, casting elongated, dancing shadows on the walls. She gasped, stumbling back, the beam sweeping across the room to land on her childhood photo, placed as always on her desk. But this time, the glass had been cracked, right through the faces of her and her younger brother. Her brother, who she hadn't spoken to since their mother passed away, a loss that scarred them both differently. The whispers started again, fainting at first, then building in intensity. They seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the crack itself. She strained to decipher them, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand yet somehow comprehended. Lost, forgotten, hungry. The crack widened further and she saw it. A glimpse, not of the ceiling behind, but of something else. A swirling vortex of colors that defied description, a nauseating geometry that twisted and rearranged itself before her eyes. She felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing her closer, beckoning her to step through. Her breath hitched. It wasn't just a physical anomaly. It was a doorway. A doorway to where? To what? And then a memory surfaced, unbidden, raw. and agonizing. A memory she had buried deep, the trauma she had tried to contain with her rigid routines and obsessive structure. A night long ago, a dark room, a figure looming over her brother and herself, not evil intent but more negligence. The sound of her mother's body hitting the floor. That night had shattered her world, leaving her with a profound sense of guilt and powerlessness. The crack wasn't just a tear in reality. It was a reflection of her own fractured psyche, a manifestation of the darkness she had tried to suppress. It was the embodiment of her lack of control, not an outside force at all. Suddenly, a new voice, a voice she knew, cut through the cacophony. Clear and calm like her own, yet twisted and distorted. It echoed the familiar words her mother used to tell her. "All will be well, Sarah. You can't control it, Sarah, but you can embrace it," the voice crooned, laced with a sickening sweetness. "Release yourself. Let go, and all those dark thoughts will leave you to be free forever." Sarah recoiled, clutching her head, the pain searing. She knew with chilling certainty that embracing must all unhold. It would mean succumbing to madness, letting the darkness consume her completely. But the pull was strong. The temptation to escape, to forget, to finally silence the voices was almost unbearable. A figure moved within the swirling vortex of the crack. Her brother, but it couldn't be. He hadn't spoken to her in years. He was smiling with the same twisted, distorted, sweet voice. "Sarah, come join us. We know what you would want." "No," she screamed, the word ripping from her throat. The flashlight clattered to the floor, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the ominous glow emanating from the crack. The building went deathly silent. Clunk, clunk. A door slammed shut down the hall, but it sounded wrong. Distant, like it belonged to another dimension. Sarah stood frozen, caught between the abyss and the shattered remnants of her sanity. The choice was hers: confront the darkness within or surrender to the horrors that lurked just beyond the threshold. The truth was there, hovering just beyond her grasp. All she would have to do is to decide. The insignificant legacy? Sarah stared at the ceiling. The vast branching network of cracks, no longer a hairline fracture, resembled a grotesque upside-down tree, its roots plunging into some unseen abyss. The air tasted metallic, and a low hum vibrated through the apartment, a constant thrum against her bones. Had it always been this loud? Or was she finally hearing the true frequency of the nightmare she'd unwittingly invited into her life? She remembered her Uncle Mark, a man she barely knew, a recluse whispered about in hushed tones at family gatherings. He'd lived in this very apartment before her, a detail she'd conveniently forgotten until now. Now, fragments of conversations filtered back, snippets about his odd hobbies, his hermit-like existence, and a series of increasingly bizarre experiments he always kept secret. Could he have been involved in something sinister? Did he somehow open the gateway that the crack represented? The neighbor, Mrs. Gable, her words echoed in her mind. Some places are never truly empty, dear, especially the ones built on old ground. This building, it remembers. Mrs. Gable. Was she an ally, or something else? Sarah had seen her lingering in the hallway more often lately, her eyes, usually hidden behind thick glasses, locked on Sarah's door with an unnerving intensity. Tap, tap, tap. She would walk on her door frame during the night. Tap, 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 tap. The flashbacks were relentless now. Not just disjointed images of her childhood trauma, but flashes of something else, something older. Ritualistic symbols etched into wood, chants in a language she didn't understand, the suffocating scent of incense on decay. The crack pulsed again, a sickly green light illuminating the room, and Sarah knew she was out of time. She had to close it. Somehow. Remembering one of the contractors mentioning patching agents one day, Sarah raced to the kitchen pantry. What did that have to do with this unexplainable crack? Her trauma, she'd buried it so deep she thought she could never find it again. She grabbed the first patching agent she could feel in the dark corner of the kitchen pantry. The agent was still sealed. Maybe this was the answer? But she hesitated. What if closing the crack wasn't the right thing to do? What if it was holding something in, something far worse than the swirling darkness she sensed on the other side? Sarah ran back to her bedroom in a fit of anger. She threw the patching agent onto the floor. It burst open, the clear liquid pooled all over the floor. The room swirled, the walls seemed to breathe, and the crack widened. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the ceiling, and Sarah felt a presence, malevolent and ancient, pressing against her mind. It showed her glimpses of Uncle Mark, chanting in a circle, his eyes burning with feverish devotion. And then a vision of something else, something indescribable, a being of pure shadow and hunger. The thing that now wanted to cross over. Sarah stumbled back, clutching her head. This wasn't just about her trauma anymore. This was about something far bigger, something that threatened to consume everything. Summoning the last vestiges of her will, Sarah focused on the patching agent. It was just a tool, but maybe, just maybe, it could be a weapon too. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the shattered container and lunged upward, flinging the remaining agent onto the crack. The crack shuddered, the green light intensified, and the laugh turned into a shriek of rage. The room vibrated violently, objects rattled on shelves, and the very air crackled with energy. Then, silence. The green light faded, the hum subsided, and the crack remained. But it was different. Smaller, fainter. It was still there, but it no longer felt like a gateway. More like a scar. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, breathless and trembling. Had she won? Had she merely delayed the inevitable? Years passed. Sarah never fully recovered. She sold the apartment, unable to shake the feeling that something was still watching her. She saw a psychiatrist who diagnosed her with complex PTSD and possible schizoaffective disorder. Medication helped, but the nightmares never completely went away. One day, scrolling through a real estate website, she saw a listing for her old apartment. Newly renovated, prime location, the description read, "Dot." A picture showed the living room, freshly painted, the ceiling smooth and white. But zooming in, her heart skipped a beat. In the upper corner, barely visible against the pristine white, a faint hairline fracture. Option 1. Another zooming in, her heart skipped a beat. In the upper corner, barely visible against the pristine white, a faint hairline fracture. Option 2. Another tenant had moved in. She sent the other tenant a message, warning them about the hairline fracture. The tenant read the message and never replied. Sarah never found out the other tenant was okay. Option 3. Sarah now works as a psychiatrist. She gets a new patient who is getting haunted by a hairline fracture in their bedroom. She refuses to work on this case, fearing she knows the trauma behind it. The legacy of the insignificant flaw lived on, a silent testament to the horrors that lie just beneath the surface of reality, waiting for the slightest crack to appear. She sold the apartment. Years passed. Sarah built a good life, found happiness, and almost forgot about the terror on the ceiling. Years later, a young couple, fresh out of college, moved into her old apartment. They were excited about their first place together, oblivious to its history. One afternoon, while arranging furniture, the young woman paused, staring up at the ceiling above their bed. "Honey," she said, her voice trembling, "do you see that?" Her boyfriend looked up. A tiny hairline crack, barely visible, snaked across the ceiling, almost imperceptible. It was in a different spot than Sarah's crack was, but it was there, a faint line scratching at the canvas of reality. And coming from the closet, a scratching sound like a small animal. But the neighbor told the young woman, "Some old buildings, they have stories to tell. Some get restless." The young woman asked, "How will I know? If I am, okay?" The neighbor answered, "Oh, you will know." The terror continues,